What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Team 7 sees Naruto past? If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments. And also check the description to original creator of this beautiful creation. A wise man had once said that, life is a long road that is easy to get lost on. At the moment, Naruto was feeling somewhat lost on that road. Looking back, he realized that he must have taken a wrong turn somewhere since the road had gone in what in his opinion was a rather disturbing direction without him realizing it until it was too late. And before I could go up to her, Ino got her hands on her and turned her into rabid Sasuke fangirl number 2. Naruto said miserably to his companion that evening. He knew that he should be at home resting or preparing himself for whatever farce Kakashi decided to spring on him and his new team tomorrow, but he had needed someone to commiserate with about his sucky new assignment, and Suzume had shown up like a gift from heaven. After he'd run into her after she'd been leaving the administration complex at the end of the mission she'd been on for the last couple of weeks, they had gone to the bar that Tetsuo-sensei had brought them to celebrate Suzume and Satoshi's promotions to Chunin, since Ichiraku's was now reserved for high points during his life. The bar fit his mood quite nicely since it was both a place where shinobi tended to go to commiserate about their problems and the place where his team had pretty much split apart. It had been a while since the team had split apart, and a while since he and Suzume had seen each other, so they had some catching up to do. As he was still a genin he had gotten cranberry juice, but that was okay since he didn't like alcohol all that much anyway. Suzume had ordered sake because they were in a bar, but wasn't drinking very much of it. Based on the occasional winces, she seemed to share his views on the flavor of alcohol. Her cup had spent far more time on the table than it did in her hand, and the tokuri was mostly full. Now, I'm expected to be on a team with both of them, and I'm certain that Kakashi will know if I try and throw tomorrow's test and report me, and I'm still considering doing it anyway. He continued unhappily. I don't even know why Kakashi wants to be my sensei. I was perfectly happy with Tetsuo-sensei. Suzume quietly gave him a pitying look. Apparently, if it was her, she wouldn't have wanted to be stuck in the same situation he was in either. Tetsuo-sensei was a good teacher whom none of them would have traded for the world, and it had been his impression that Suzume and Satoshi would have eventually returned to the team after they'd had their chance to fly on a few B-ranked missions if this hadn't happened. And how was your mission? He finally asked after having forced his teammate to listen to him for over an hour. He'd been taught some manners over the years and knew that it wouldn't be polite to spend the entire evening trying to get some sympathy over his fate, and not offer a shoulder of his own should it be needed even if his mood was a completely crappy one at the moment. He knew that something was up with Suzume as well since she hadn't looked entirely happy when he'd run into her, but it was more of a my day was crappy unhappy rather than the my life just got completely steamrolled. Unhappy he was feeling. It absolutely sucked. Suzume replied. The client would not stop hitting on me. I wouldn't have minded it so much if he were young and handsome, but he had to be like 50, and he was missing half his teeth. On the way back, we decided to stop at an onsen. Unfortunately for us in this case, it was a mixed bath. What should have been a very relaxing evening was completely ruined when this white-haired pervert stared at me and Eri the entire time, not even bothering to try and hide the fact that he was doing so. As Suzume shared her problems, he listened to his teammate as attentively as he could. Not only was it the polite thing to do, but you never knew what you could learn when you did so. Someone had once let a good bit of blackmail material slip without realizing it in his presence, and he would have missed it if he hadn't been paying attention. Since then, he'd never wasted an opportunity to needle the person in question with his knowledge he'd gained every time he encountered him. Right now, however, he was providing a sympathetic ear for his teammate, and a shoulder to cry on since she had done the same for him. Sasuke growled as he pummeled the training dummy with his fists. The idiot, the moron, the dead last had been a genin for 2 years and he hadn't so much not noticed it as refused to believe it until he'd had his nose rubbed in undeniable proof of the fact. The person who had been held up as being the most likely to fail since day one at the academy had surpassed him and left him in the dust long before he'd even realized that he'd flown by, and instead of trying to catch up and surpass him like he should have been doing, he'd spent 2 years ignoring the now very obvious dust cloud that had been left in his wake. As he pummeled the dummy he was training with, he reviewed his and the Uzumaki's time at the academy together, trying to see if there were signs of when and how this had happened. As he thought back on it, There had been one phrase that constantly came out of the mouth of the boy who, now that he thought about it, managed to catch a chunin in a trap that only utilized a chalkboard eraser and a bit of grease, and that was, "I was joking." Shuriken go flying everywhere except the target and nearly take out the sensei. "I was joking." Kunai hits a bird passing overhead rather than the stationary target 5 feet below it. "I was joking." The assistant instructor's kneecap nearly gets broken due to a wild and unpredictable move. You get the picture. Every single time after every single failure, he'd hear, "I was joking." Back then, he had thought that it had been the idiot's way of trying to cover for his obvious inadequacies, especially considering the fact that the boy couldn't even do a proper bunshin. He was wrong, however. Apparently, the Uzumaki really had just been joking around. The little bastard had played him. He'd played all of them, and when he'd gotten bored with his little game, he went and blew through the graduation exam like it was nothing. Now knowing that the Uzumaki could have graduated any time he'd wanted to, he tried to think it through to find a logical reason for why he would do such a thing. It didn't make sense. Why would the Uzumaki do something like that, something so absolutely pointless, when he could be well on his way in his ninja career? After several moments of thought, he finally remembered the most likely reason for why the Uzumaki behaved the way he had. After that man had killed the clan, the laws had been changed, and the lowest age at which anyone could graduate the academy had been raised to 10. Because of this, the Uzumaki had been forcibly held back for who knew how many years. Long and tedious years in which the Uzumaki had undoubtedly grown bored just as he had near the end of his stay at the academy. He'd heard stories about geniuses who were held back and destroyed their surroundings out of sheer boredom. One of the reasons Uchiha Madara had been sent out on the battlefield at such a young age had been because of the chaos he had been causing in the clan encampment. While Naruto hadn't been setting tents on fire and destroying cooking pots, he had caused enough chaos that the academy had finally been willing to let him go and been glad of it. Now knowing what the Uzumaki was, he knew that he would have to find a way to surpass him before he would be ready to kill that man. If he could find a way to defeat one true genius, he would be able to find a way to defeat another. Sakura checked her supplies again, feeling apprehensive about what the morning and the future following it would hold. She would be taking a test with her team, a test that would decide the team's future, including even if they would still be a team following the test, and she feared how Sasuke would react if she caused them to fail. Sasuke would be extremely disappointed, and probably would reject her in favor of Ino. Naruto, however, Naruto would. On the day Naruto had pinned her and threatened her, she had complained to her mother about how Naruto had threatened to break her arm practically the instant she got home. Her mother had promptly dragged her down to the office of the civilian peacekeeping force that had risen up in the wake of the Uchiha massacre to deal with civilian-on-civilian crime to make a report. Once they got there, her mother had stormed straight up to the desk of the first officer she spotted, dragging her in her wake. "I want that monster arrested," her mother yelled, as soon as she had gotten the attention of the officer she dragged her in front of. "Who are you talking about, ma'am?" the female officer asked, as she tried to calm her mother down. "The Uzumaki boy, who else?" her mother replied. After her mother's demand, the officer went over to a computer and started putting in information. Whatever result she received once the information had been processed had caused a frown to mar her rather plain features. She looked rather apologetic when she returned soon after. "I'm sorry," the officer said when she reached her desk where she and her mother were standing. "Uzumaki Naruto is a registered shinobi, and therefore you'll have to file your complaint at the administration complex." Snarling obscenities under her breath, her mother grabbed her, turned, angrily stormed out of the station, and dragged her all the way to the administration complex, where she then dragged her all the way over to the desks where people registered civilian complaints against shinobi. "I would like to file a complaint against Uzumaki Naruto," her mother said to the bored-looking ninja at the desk the instant she arrived. "What is the nature of this complaint?" the ninja asked, grabbing a form and a pen. "That filthy little monster threatened to break my daughter's arm," her mother replied. "At what time was this threat made, and where were you and what were you doing at the time?" the Chunin asked as he started filling out information on the form. "I was outside the academy. I had just gotten out of class for the day, and noticed him hanging around on that swing in the tree near the entrance. I tried to hit him," she replied, deciding to leave the "for pretending to be a ninja" part out, considering the reason for her current location. "Let me get this straight. the man said coldly as he crumpled the form that he'd started filling out. You, an academy student, decided to attack a full-fledged shinobi who is only a genin because he had a run of seriously bad luck, and isn't currently on his way to the Chunin exams because we don't want to give you a chance to legally get their revenge on him for what he did to 2 of their genin, and you want us to punish him because he decided to go easy on you and let you off with a warning? As they say, hindsight is 20/20. She should never have let her mother drag her to the tower considering the fact that Naruto had already informed her of what would happen, and she should never have asked what Naruto had done to those Iwa genin. The desk ninja who had apparently heard the story from a friend of his who was a Junin who had been to the Chunin exams in Kiri had gleefully told her in vivid and extremely gruesome detail. Funny, Sasuke had never seemed to notice that she had kept silent about Naruto's ninja status or lack thereof after that. If Naruto had been willing to do something like that to people who had just gotten in the way of his promotion, what would he do to her if she failed tomorrow's test? That question haunted her for the rest of the evening as she prepared, hoping that she didn't mess up and upset either Naruto or Sasuke-kun. Kakashi polished one of the bells against his sleeve before checking it again for any spots or smudges. Everything had to be perfect for tomorrow, including the bells that had been in use since the Nidaime had first taken a team. Because Omaro, Minato-sensei's son, would be his student. Despite the fact that the kid seemed to resent the fact that he'd been taken from his other sensei, and the fact that he was Chunin in all but name, it would be worth it. He owed it to Minato-sensei to make sure that Naruto was at least half the man he had been. He had failed everyone else. Obito was gone. Rin was gone. Kushina-san was gone, and Minato-sensei was gone. Naruto was all he had left. Naruto grumbled as the alarm clock got him up a little earlier than usual. He wasn't as bright-eyed and bushy-tailed as he'd normally be in the morning since he'd spent half the night commiserating over his new assignment and questioning the mental faculties of the Hokage with Suzume. Poor Suzume had had a bit of a rough few weeks herself as well. Along with the dangers of being a shinobi, Kunoichi were forced to endure men constantly staring at them and making advances or worse because they were women. The white-haired pervert who had ruined Suzume's bath was going on his prank list. He'd know him when he ran into him, since he got a good description of him from Suzume. Right now though, he was feeling even sorrier for himself than he was for his teammate. He'd been put on what had to have been the genin team from hell. There had been a time when he would have been over the moon at being placed on a team with Sakura, and an admittedly much shorter period of time when he would have been happy to be on a team with Sasuke. That time however had long since passed. Time had changed them and his views of them, and not for the better. He had once had a massive crush on the pink-haired girl named Sakura, and allowed her to hit him because that was the only physical contact he had gotten from her, and he had believed that it would be worth all of the pain and misery in the end when he and Sakura were together. In those days, he'd had a really naive view of what a boyfriend was, and after learning from his teammates who had already started navigating such relationships, he now knew that what he had actually wanted from Sakura had been to be her friend. Back then, the most he had wanted from the girl was a couple of dinner dates, and for her to hang out with him, which was pretty much the definition of friend. Admittedly, he hadn't gone about winning her over the right way even though he did give her presents. But, as Tetsuo-sensei and Suzume had explained, her reaction to him had been both extreme, and extremely abusive, and that any relationship that developed should he have managed to win her over would most likely be an unhealthy and abusive one since there was a good chance that Sakura would have continued to abuse him out of habit even if he had become her friend. Sakura was like a rose. She was pretty to look at but, man did she have thorns. Sasuke. Sasuke was a rather thorny issue himself. At the beginning of their time at the academy when they had still been small and he'd been in a different class, Sasuke had been a rather nice boy. He'd even played with the Uchiha a couple of times before the boy's father interfered and told him not to associate with him. Then, he changed and not for the better. It was understandable why he changed considering, but still. Sasuke had always been a much better student than him, and back then, that had frustrated him to no end. He had hurt and humiliated himself many times trying to prove himself the Uchiha's equal, and all he had gotten from the boy in return was cold dismissal. Even then, he still would have been willing to be the boy's friend had he been asked, but there came the day that ruined any chance of friendship whatsoever in his book. That day had been the day he had first run into Sasuke after he had graduated. The one time he had achieved something before Sasuke, The boy had ignored his accomplishment rather than acknowledge it and, as he later learned from Iruka-sensei, chose to completely deny that it had ever happened. Having either Sasuke or Sakura on the team he could have learned to deal with, but having both, however. Throwing the true genin test would be his best option. He was already a genin, so the worst that could happen to him in this case would be for him to be returned to Tetsuo-sensei with a black mark on his record. As long as he kept his nose clean, and didn't get any more of those, his career would be fine. Since he knew the actual purpose of the test, and his teammates didn't, things should turn out fine in that endeavor. Thinking about the test that was to come reminded him of the first time he had taken the final genin test. The test was over and his new sensei had told them that they'd passed. "Does anyone know what the purpose of this test was?" asked the man whom he wasn't sure whether to call Shimura-sensei or Tetsuo-sensei since he didn't know what sort of person he was yet. He didn't know what the test could have been for other than to screw with the kids who'd just graduated, and from his teammates' blank looks, he could guess that they didn't know either. "Teamwork," his new sensei said when all three of them failed to answer. "Up until now, you have been tested individually and have gotten by on your own merits. In the shinobi ranks, however, ninja are most often sent on missions in teams. To succeed, the team has to work together, and anyone who goes off on their own not only puts themselves at risk, but puts their entire team at risk as well. This test was intended to weed out those who would not be able to work together with their teammates. In this test, one's own self-interests are put at stake, making it more difficult to work as a team, especially considering the fact that you have not been ordered to do so. I told you that you had to catch me before 10, and that the last person to catch me would be the one who failed. Had you just scrabbled around individually trying to be the first or at the very least the second to catch me, I would not have let you do so. While you could have done a better job of working together, you did so nonetheless. Uzumaki here set up a number of ingenious traps, and you Suzume-chan and Satoshi-kun worked together to corner me in them and capture me." His new sensei continued. He decided that it would be a very wise thing to say nothing at this point. If sensei said that they had worked together, and he wouldn't say otherwise. "Because of this, you have passed, and I am proud of you all," his new sensei said. His sensei was proud of him. He had taken the test before when he joined Team 5, knew the purpose of the test, and Kakashi knew that he knew. If Sasuke and Sakura worked together, he would at least have to pretend to be making some small effort to pass while subtly trying to break the team apart without Kakashi noticing. But, if his would-be teammates did what he thought they would do, which was what about 2/3 of the teams usually ended up doing every year, he wouldn't have to do anything more than sit back and not clue them in. Grumbling, he pulled himself out of his musings over the unwanted test and headed out the door. Even though he had a sneaking suspicion that Kakashi would be running on Kakashi time plus in order to rile his new recruits and make them even more ill-tempered when the time for the test came, he set out to reach the designated meeting place near the memorial on time. Instead of taking the time to prepare breakfast, he took a granola bar with him, and a spare for later because there was no way in hell that he was going to go all morning without eating, and because he'd been run until he'd puked once before, and he knew it wasn't fun if you had a lot in your stomach when that happened. He wouldn't put it past Kakashi to run them until they puked as part of the test. Since he had a great deal of stamina, Kakashi would more than likely run him that much harder than the others if he did so. When he reached the meeting point, he found Sasuke and Sakura already there. Sakura looked like she hadn't slept in a week and Sasuke looked rather tired as well. Apparently, from the looks of it, they had both individually pulled an all-nighter. He'd pulled all-nighters before, and wasn't as affected by them, but he'd gotten some sleep last night, so he felt more put out than tired like his teammates were, as he was sure he'd be stuck waiting for Kakashi again. He remembered what waiting for Kakashi had been like during the week the man had taught him the Kage Bunshin. Every day that he'd had those lessons with Kakashi, he had sat there increasingly impatiently for hours on end until the man had finally arrived. The first day had been the worst. If Tetsuo-sensei hadn't warned him about the man's habits, he would have thought that his sensei had been pulling a trick on him. In fact, he had almost believed he'd been tricked by the time Kakashi had finally deigned to show up. While Tetsuo-sensei had been rather nice compared to most of the rest of the village, he hadn't liked him all that much in the beginning. Tetsuo-sensei had eventually warmed up to him as time went on though. As he watched Sasuke and Sakura yawn as they struggled to remain awake, His hands itched to set up traps all around the designated training ground, and he knew that he had at least 2 hours in which he could do so. However, he had decided not to make any effort on this no matter how much it stung his professional pride. So, instead of littering the area with a number of traps a Junin would be hard-pressed to avoid, he settled down with the books he'd brought with him. He started with a reread of Uchiha Madara's A Treatise on Traps. In the early days of Konoha, back before the Shodai Hokage had been selected, Uchiha Madara had written several books for the new ninja library, hoping to curry favor with the shinobi who were flocking to the newly forming village and be elected to the position of Hokage himself. After Senju Hashirama was selected to be the Shodai Hokage by the will of both the people of the village and the daimyo of Fire Country because he'd practically built the village's infrastructure from the ground up single-handedly, Madara had tried to take the Hokage's hat in battle. The Uchiha had not been victorious, and had died in the titanic struggle that had formed the Valley of the End, leaving behind a legacy of a mostly forgotten series of rather insightful if somewhat boring books on the ninja arts. After reading it, he was convinced that the trap book would have been the standard textbook for trap specialists if the man who'd written it hadn't fallen so far out of favor. It was brilliant, easy to understand despite being a bit boring and long-winded, and some of the traps it showed you how to make were rather ingenious if somewhat dated. Even with all of the books he'd brought with him including Madara's Traps Treatise, the wait was a long and boring one. Kakashi finally showed up with 2 bento and an alarm clock while he was in the middle of the field cooking guide which he'd picked up because he really didn't want to be stuck eating only field rations when he left the village on missions since Satoshi wasn't there to cook for him. Seeing the bento boxes, the reason the man had told them not to eat breakfast suddenly hit him. The bastard had wanted them to fight over lunch. "You're late," Sakura, who had spent the last 4 hours staring at him and whimpering again, screeched. Considering how scared of him she'd been since the day he'd snapped and told Sakura that if she tried to hit him again he'd break her arm, he was surprised that she'd even had the courage to admit disliking him yesterday, especially as vehemently as she had. In contrast, Sasuke however had pretended not to react to both Sakura's yell and Kakashi's lateness. The boy had some pretty good acting skills. Either that, or he was extremely good at denial, which could be a serious problem. He himself had refrained from reacting much but, that was because he'd gotten used to Kakashi's tardiness long ago and he'd heard worse yelling around the village. "So what was it this time?" he asked before the man could give one of his stock excuses. "I know it wasn't the memorial since I can see it from here." "So what was it? Porn? You kill another expensive alarm clock and have to give it a decent burial? Or did you make those lunches yourself?" "The alarm clock actually," Kakashi replied as he held up the shiny new alarm clock he'd brought with him. That clock was most likely going to suffer a most gruesome end on Kakashi's nightstand after it was done being used as a timer for whatever test Kakashi had planned. When it came to the more experienced ninjas, alarm clocks usually didn't last too long. After a while, certain reactions become instinctive in regards to loud noises going off practically right next to one's ear. Most ninja got around this little problem by training themselves to wake up at a certain time. When it came to some of the more stubborn ninja with a little extra disposable income however, he understood though, he'd actually broken the alarm clock he'd had since he was a little kid shortly after he came back from Kiri. The kunai jamming its inner workings had made it completely unsalvageable, and he'd been forced to purchase another one. Fortunately, the nightmares had faded a bit, and he hadn't broken any since then. After setting his doomed clock aside, Kakashi explained the rules of his test which involved bells. When Kakashi had mentioned coming at him with the intent to kill, he felt a surge of some emotion he couldn't name because it seemed to be a mix of several emotions at the same time. The last time he'd gone at someone with the intent of killing them, rather than in defense of self or others, he had done so, and he'd been suffering from nightmares ever since. While he knew that Kakashi could beat him hands down if there was a fight, there was still the worry that something would happen. When the test finally started several hours later than had originally been scheduled, Sasuke and Sakura did as he had anticipated and promptly split up without a word or any covert signals or gestures indicating planning of some sort passing between the two of them as they did so. Realizing that he'd been given his out, he himself moved to the trees in order to find a location in which to kill time until the test was over. As soon as he found a sweet little hiding spot, he trapped it in case Kakashi or one of his new teammates showed up, and pulled out a book and the extra granola bar. He had learned long ago to always keep at least a little food on him so he didn't end up starving if there was an accident with the supplies. He'd also learned to keep his granola bars in a separate pocket from his emergency rations bars, as both were roughly the same shape and size. On more than one occasion, he'd accidentally handed out one of the latter when he'd intended to give one of the former, and had accidentally grabbed one of the ration bars for himself when he'd meant to grab one of the granola ones. Granola bars were sort of sweet, and emergency rations bars, to put it mildly, tasted like crap. Absent-mindedly opening and taking a bite of the one you didn't want while absorbed in another activity was an unpleasant experience. Eventually, after Sakura screamed indicating that Kakashi had done something that had taken her out of the running and Sasuke got his ass handed to him from the sound of it, Kakashi made his way over to him. When he noticed the man was nearby, he casually pretended to ignore the man's presence while preparing to fight if necessary. Instead of attacking him as he half expected, Kakashi just stood there and sighed. "What are you doing, Naruto?" Kakashi asked, looking up into the tree in which he was perched. Waiting for the other two to get a clue, since the test was for their benefit. He replied, "As soon as they pull their heads out of their asses, they can easily come and find me." "Whatever," Kakashi said as he hopped into a nearby tree and pulled out his own book, clearly not impressed with Sasuke's and Sakura's performances either. By the time the alarm went off indicating that the test was over, Sasuke and Sakura, who'd been working separately, still hadn't gotten the idea of what the test was about. Sakura was tied to the post since, despite the fact he'd put absolutely no effort into passing the test, Kakashi was well aware of the fact that trying to tie him up would be a futile effort, and since Sasuke had actually made a pretty good try at getting the bells. As soon as Kakashi ordered them not to feed Sakura and vanished to a spot nearby to make sure they were following orders or whatever, he cut Sakura loose. As far as he was concerned, the test was done, everyone failed, and he could go home. As soon as the girl was free, he tossed her his lunch since he planned on seeing if Tetsuo-sensei was in the mood for barbecue, as today definitely was not an Ichiraku day and the girl had looked and sounded as if she had been starving all morning. As soon as he started walking away, Kakashi shushined in with a thunderous expression on his face and a genjutsu that showed an ominous stormy sky complete with overly dramatic flashes of lightning stretching across the scenery behind him. Apparently, the man had taken some genjutsu tips from a guy whose seaside sunset was rapidly becoming infamous. "And, just where do you think you're going?" the man asked. "The test is over and he started, explaining why he was ditching his new and now former teammates. "Past," Kakashi said in an overly cheerful manner as the genjutsu dissipated, revealing the sunny autumn sky. "What?" he asked, completely surprised. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be happening. While he stood there staring at Kakashi in open-mouthed shock, Kakashi launched into an explanation of how the team had passed because he'd chucked his lunch at Sakura out of pity for the girl, and all he could think was, crap. If he'd known that his act of charity would have had this result, he would have taken the lunch with him and dumped it somewhere. Near the end of the lecture, Kakashi said something he thought was particularly wise, and therefore most likely borrowed from someone else. "Those who break the rules are trash. Those who abandon their teammates are worse than trash," Kakashi had said. Considering his, Sasuke and Sakura's behavior during the test, he could already say that his new and unwanted team was currently worse than trash. The only way to go from there was up, right? Tucci frowned when he saw the blonde boy coming up the street. One of his best customers, who happened to be the son of at least one of and quite possibly two of his late best customers, had abruptly stopped coming, and he wanted to know why, especially considering the fact that the last time he'd done something like that was when he was recovering from some serious trauma. It wasn't just that Naruto's absence was putting his shinobi customers on edge for some reason, he was slightly worried for the boy, and Ayame had been rather worried about him as well. "Hey Naruto," he called, getting the boy's attention. "Yeah, old man?" Naruto called back as he headed over to the stand. "Why haven't you been coming?" he asked. "I know it can't be missions, since Ayame's seen you around the village while she was making deliveries." Naruto sat down more out of habit than anything, and began to tell him exactly why he hadn't been coming by lately. The boy's sitting down had been exactly what he'd been hoping for, since he knew from experience that once he sat down, the boy wouldn't leave without eating. Without being asked, he began preparing the noodles for the boy's first bowl. He knew from experience that if he gave the boy one free bowl, he would always eat more. If he did not eat more right then for whatever reason, then he would come back at a later date and do so. It had been a free bowl of ramen that had netted the boy as a regular customer years ago. They put me on a different team a few weeks back, Naruto said, sounding unhappy. That was it. Though he and his daughter were civilians, his father had been a shinobi, like the vast majority of his customer base were. After spending so much time around shinobi, he understood some of the issues that came with the job that he decided long ago was not for him. Naruto's problem, though highly uncommon during peacetime, was unfortunately a rather common one during times of war. The academy was like an elementary school with weapons. Some kids become fond of the instructors there and made friends for life there, and some kids didn't, but the genin teams were a different issue entirely. In a properly run genin team, the bond between the genin and their junin sensei was a rather close one, approaching that of one between a parent and a child. Genin often stayed close to their junin sensei and their teammates long after they had advanced to chunin or even junin themselves, unless one or the other ended up dying. Sometimes, however, a disaster of some sort occurred, and a genin would be forced to accept a new team and call a new person sensei. When this happened, the genin in question often had a hard time adjusting to the person who, in their view, had usurped the role of sensei, and their new teammates at first. Eventually, things either got better or the genin got transferred. But Naruto's placement with a different instructor didn't make sense. Shimura Tetsuo was an active duty junin in good health who could easily have taken a pair of new genin from the fall class to fill out his team to replace the two who had advanced to chunin, as he had been talking about doing at the end of the summer exams. There couldn't have been a falling out between Naruto and his sensei, since he'd seen Tetsuo yesterday and he seemed fine with Naruto, if somewhat upset about something that pertained to the boy. Any reasons he could think of that would necessitate Naruto being forcibly removed from the Shimura's care would have quite likely ended with the man being in prison or executed. Since the man was alive, free, and still a junin, none of those things could have happened. "You're not too happy with your new team, I take it," he said, hoping that Naruto would provide more information so he could solve this little puzzle that was frankly beginning to worry him a little as well. "Not really. I'll work with them because it's my duty, but," Naruto replied. "Kakashi was an okay teacher when he taught me the Kage Bunshin, but he's not Tetsuo sensei, and he doesn't really have time for me because he's stuck fixing whatever the hell the academy did wrong with the other two. I know for a fact that whatever it wasn't Iruka sensei's fault because he did a good job with me. I heard somewhere that Mizuki jerk who tried stealing from the Hokage had been a teaching assistant, so it was probably his doing." Now that it was done cooking, he set the bowl of Naruto's usual down in front of the boy, and the boy began to eat, continuing his story as he did so. As he listened, he found himself wondering what the heck was going on. Why would Kakashi take Naruto? By all accounts, the shinobi who had been coming here off and on since he was a little shrimp hadn't been interested in taking on any students. He'd been hearing rumors recently that the man had been given some sort of bribe to make him take a team this year though. Had Naruto been the bribe? Why would Naruto be considered an acceptable bribe in the first place? Ever since Kakashi could barely see over the counter, the only person he'd seemed to care about was the Yondaime. Well, it would seem that a certain theory of his had indeed been correct. He had speculated about it for years, ever since the Hokage had shown up with a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, chubby-cheeked toddler who bore the surname of a certain redhead that Minato had brought here on a couple of dinner dates before he became Hokage, but nothing had seemed to confirm or deny his suspicions. Until now, that was. It would seem that he was right. Naruto was the son of two of his best customers, one of whom had pissed off a shitload of people and died, leaving the boy completely unprotected. And Sakura's totally scared of me, but I guess that it was sort of my fault since I had threatened to break her arm when she tried to hit me. Naruto continued between bites. I hadn't been in a good mood that day, so I was a little harsher than usual when I decided to teach her why it wasn't a good idea to try to hit me. Noticing that Naruto's free bowl was almost finished, he began to get Naruto's second bowl ready. Things were getting back to normal now. Something just didn't seem right when he didn't see Naruto's smiling face at least a couple times a week when he wasn't on missions, and it wasn't just him who felt that way either. He had been losing several shinobi customers who had avoided his stand because something had seemed off as well. They should come back now that Naruto was back. Konohamaru sighed in relief. Since Naruto was talking now, it would be safe to approach him. Over the last few weeks, Naruto had been in an odd, grumbling bad mood which was different from his normal, bad days, which had been happening far less frequently lately. Today however, when he had first seen Naruto after he had gotten off his D rank of the day, he had noticed that it had been looking to be a bad day. He could tell even before he'd seen his boss's face just by the way he was walking. However, instead of remaining in sullen solitary silence and snapping at all who approached the way he usually did on a bad day, Naruto's mood had almost magically changed after he'd had a talk with the proprietor of Ichiraku and a couple bowls of ramen. When Naruto had settled his bill with the proprietor of Ichiraku Ramen and continued on his way, made his move. He wanted to do more than play today since he'd recently been informed that come January, he'd be attending the academy rather than being exclusively trained by Ebisu as he had been for the last couple of years. While, as he'd been repeatedly informed, that was a good thing, he was still very nervous. Naruto had already attended the academy, and would therefore know what to expect and be able to tell him. Naruto had taught him a great deal over the last several months, including the fact that there was no shortcut to becoming Hokage. Those who try to take what they see as the easy way to Hokage's hat more often than not get hurt or killed. That had been true in the days of Senju Hashirama, and it was true now. The road to becoming Hokage was a long and hard one, and the academy was one of the steps along the way. With a cry of, "Hey boss," he rounded the corner after Naruto. Perhaps after they got all of the serious stuff out of the way, they could play ninja. He learned some of the coolest stuff while playing ninja, like the Oiroke Jutsu. Naruto had not been having a very good day. It had all started early in the morning when he decided to empty out his closet before training because it was looking a little full. After clearing out all of the trash, he started pulling out the clothing to check and see what fit and what didn't. The stuff that didn't would be going to the orphanage's charity bin, which had been where he had gotten a great deal of his clothes before the academy. Usually, he wore his clothes out before he outgrew them, but there was some stuff that had been in the back of the closet for a long time. It had been while he had been doing this cleaning that he had found the sandals buried at the back of the closet underneath an old shirt. They were much too small for him now, as his feet had grown a couple of sizes in the past year, and he couldn't have worn them again even if he had wanted to. Not that he'd ever wanted to see them again, much less wear them. The first thing he noticed about them when he finally processed what he was looking at was the fact that they still smelled faintly of old blood. His first thought had been to throw them away and forget about them, but years of conditioning had kept him from throwing away anything that could potentially be useful. He couldn't think of how they would be useful though, they didn't fit, were no good for traps, and brought back memories he would rather have stayed buried. In the end, figuring that they'd be useful for someone else, he dumped them in the orphanage pile. To make matters worse, training that day had gone abysmally as usual. The team building exercises were little more than a farce as neither Sasuke nor Sakura had wanted to work with him, and frankly the only reason he'd been willing to work with them was because it was his duty. Had they been out in the field, he wouldn't have left them behind, but he wasn't certain that they wouldn't leave him behind. The moniker of team was a sad joke when it came to their group. Sasuke had wanted to do everything by himself, and Sakura had gone along with Sasuke, whom she was completely obsessed over. Taijutsu training had followed the failed team building exercise, which had even Kakashi about ready to scream in frustration. The less said about that, the better. Sasuke was good at taijutsu, nearly at Suzume's level, and therefore this team's taijutsu specialist. Taijutsu most definitely wasn't his own specialty, however. He could do the standard academy form thanks to Tetsuo-sensei, but, when he was forced to fight, he usually went with a style that worked for him, which Tetsuo-sensei constantly lamented over, calling it a combination between the academy form and a bar brawl without the bar. Kakashi wasn't too happy with his style either, but had remarked that it seemed surprisingly effective for its purposes and would be much better if he worked on his speed. In contrast to Sasuke's excellent example of a bastardized version of the Uchiha fighting style, and his rather unorthodox style, Sakura's style was textbook perfect academy, and a rather weak example of it at that. Once again, Kakashi had been forced to attempt to begin to deal with Sakura's inadequacies, and therefore had set him and Sasuke to sparring once more. He hated sparring with Sasuke. No matter what he did, even if he won the match, Sasuke would accuse him of holding back and get upset. The thing was, he hadn't really been holding back. He'd perform much better in a real battle situation when he was pumped up on adrenaline and whatnot and actually aiming to kill, but, for training purposes, he wasn't holding back. He'd told Sasuke this many times, but the boy refused to believe him. This refusal to believe him always led to an unpleasant argument, and today was no exception. After the day's training which had left all of them in a foul mood had come a mission. Normally, those weren't too bad, even though going from C-ranked missions to D's had practically felt like being demoted, but it seemed that today Kakashi had asked the missions assignment desk to pick the worst one possible in order to drive his team together through shared trauma. If that had been what Kakashi had been up to when he'd selected the mission, his plan had backfired spectacularly. However, as babysitting a spoiled 2-year-old who had only just begun potty training couldn't come close to comparing to watching comrades get killed, or coming home to discover that your entire family has been murdered by your older brother on the trauma scale. After the mission was over, he'd gone home and gathered up the orphanage charity pile he'd set aside that morning, being careful to place the sandals where he couldn't see them, and hauled it over to the orphanage. The orphanage itself brought back bad memories of a different sort. While he hadn't been abused there, he had been isolated, and had many painful memories of being alone despite the fact that he'd been surrounded by other children. He'd been about to dump the pile of clothes into the charity bin when one of the staff came over and took it from him, looking at him suspiciously the entire time. This was par for the course for one of them, however, since they had constantly blamed him for crap he hadn't done while he'd been living here, and looked about ready to accuse him of something even now. After carefully examining each article of clothing, the woman either rejected it or neatly folded it and put it in a pile. Everything would have been fine if she hadn't put the damn sandals on top of the pile, adding those memories to the unpleasant memories that he associated with this place. He didn't say anything as he left, though. It'd just make things worse if he did. He'd been on his way back home from the orphanage when old man Tucci had called out to him. He liked Tucci. The man had been nice to him, and had served him for as long as he could remember, even back before Iruka had started treating him to ramen. He remembered Iruka's slight surprise over the fact that he already knew the place when he had taken him here for the first time. He shouldn't have been so startled that he knew this place, considering how well known it was. Maybe it had been surprise over the fact that Tucci had served him without fuss, unlike most restaurant owners in Konoha who either kicked him out or served him last. Tucci had given him a sympathetic ear, some good advice, and a free bowl of ramen. All three of these worked towards picking his mood up significantly. His mood raised even more after he'd finished his meal and heard Konohamaru call out to him. Konohamaru was a good kid who always brightened what would have otherwise been a dull day. Hitaki Kakashi sighed. It had been over 4.5 months since he'd gotten his team, and throughout that entire time, it had refused to bond into something resembling a cohesive whole, or at the very least, something resembling his second genin team, which had been somewhat unbalanced yet still managed to work somehow, not letting their frequent arguments get in the way of their missions. For some strange reason, it wasn't a well-known fact that he had been the only survivor of 2 teams under Minato-sensei. When he was 5, he and a pair of 10-year-olds had been given to Minato-sensei, who had been in his late teens at the time, to be his first genin team. 8 months after their graduation, Minato-sensei had entered them in the Chunin exams to see what they were up against, and hopefully do much better next time. He and his team did well enough back then, but he had been the only one on the team to make Chunin. Before they could get another chance at a promotion, his teammates had been killed in the war on what had been supposed to be a routine mission when a well-hidden trap had gone off, catching his 2 teammates in it. For the next few years after that, it had been just him and Minato-sensei. When he was 9, Minato had taken on a pair of academy graduates who were his own age in spite of his protests. They became Team 7, and they had stayed together even after the other 2 had become Chunin as well. In the end, it had taken death to separate them. First came Obito's when the other boy had died, saving his life. Then came Rin's when he couldn't see any other way out of the situation they were in and had fully expected to join her soon. Then came Minato-sensei's on that dark night when the Kyuubi had been unleashed upon the village. In the early days after Rin and Obito had been put on the team, things had been somewhat strained. He'd been the aloof one, much like Sasuke, because he'd closed himself off to just about everyone except Minato-sensei after his father had died. Rin had been the one with the crush on the aloof one, much like Sakura was now, and Obito had been the one to ease the tension of difficult missions with humor that was both intentional and unintentional. Eventually, after a great deal of struggle, they had found balance, and had even become friends before it all ended. With this team however, there wasn't even the precarious balance his Team 7 had had in the beginning when he had viewed Obito and Rin as a pair of interlopers who were taking Minato-sensei's attention away from him. While his students could now perform the team formations flawlessly, and complete group tasks when ordered to do so, there was something completely missing, and he knew exactly what it was. There was no laughter, no joy, not even a vague sense of camaraderie, earned through shared trials or otherwise. While there was a Kakashi and a Rin, there was no Obito to brighten the day and make them stop taking themselves so seriously. In fact, the teammate most likely to have been the one to provide good cheer had been in a foul and surly mood for several months, and was starting to show signs of extreme restlessness. He could understand Naruto's restlessness, as he was feeling it too. He hadn't been this inactive in a long time, and hadn't stayed within the boundaries of Konoha for this long in years, and the last time he'd done so had been because he'd been dragged back to the village mostly dead and had needed a long time to recuperate. With Naruto going completely stir-crazy, odds were that there would be no meaningful progress anytime soon. Perhaps, what the entire team needed was to get away from it all. A change of scenery would do them some good, and give them a chance at a fresh start. In peacetime, a C rank was practically a paid vacation, and a vacation was exactly what this team needed. Naruto had taken C ranks before, so there was a good chance that the Hokage would allow his team to take one now, despite how recently two of his students had graduated, as there was usually at least a 6-month wait before C ranks were handed out to rookie teams. With his mind made up, he resolved to request a C rank after the team's current mission ended. Now to catch that stupid cat. Why had he signed the team up for this one? Oh yeah, shared trauma, which was rather pointless since both Sasuke and Naruto had experienced worse, much worse. He winced as a particularly nasty swear word came in over his radio headset. Great. The perpetual argument between Sasuke and Naruto had already started, and it wasn't the nice friendly kind between rivals, like the ones he and Obito used to have. How the hell they managed to successfully complete missions while tearing at each other's throats, he didn't know. Naruto stared at Kakashi in barely restrained shock as the man requested a C rank mission. While the opportunity to get out of the village was appreciated since he'd been feeling boxed in for a while, he had to wonder what the man had been thinking. Tetsuo-sensei had waited almost a year before requesting a C rank for his old team because he'd wanted to make sure that the team could work almost seamlessly as a whole before he took them outside the village and into potential danger. What happened in River Country was another story entirely, but the dynamic on this team, to put it mildly, sucked however. They were worse than a team that consisted of members of clans that were going through a three-way feud. If there was some sort of incident, there was a good chance that all of the cooperative team training that they had done would go flying out the window. Based on his attitude and past behavior, Sasuke would more than likely race into the fray and face it head-on without pausing to consider the danger or even a possible plan, while Sakura screamed for him to save her, and he'd probably be forced to rescue them both, if Kakashi wasn't forced to rescue all three of them, that is. Fortunately, things didn't usually go wrong on C ranks during peacetime, and they usually ended up being more of an advanced training trip for Genin, the equivalent of D ranks for Chunin, and something like a milk run for Junin. Unfortunately for him and his team however, the Chunin always got first pick and took all of the better missions, leaving the more than slightly sucky ones to the more experienced Genin teams who came in to get what was left over. As a general rule of thumb, Junin escorted princesses, Chunin escorted merchants, and Genin escorted brats. For some reason that probably had to do with the fact that the tobacco in his pipe didn't exactly smell like tobacco, the Hokage complied with Kakashi's request, and he was now stuck on a last pick of the day mission, which he just knew was going to royally suck since both all of the Chunin and the other Genin teams who'd dropped by earlier had already rejected it. Great. Things just kept getting better and better. Well, there was one high point of the mission, and that was that he'd be able to get a chance to see where his mother was born, or rather the ruins of the village in which his mother had been born. Wave had once been Whirlpool before it had been reorganized following the invasion during the Second War, and what was left of Uzushiogakure was somewhere in that tiny country. He hadn't really been expecting much when it came to the person that his team was going to escort, and even those lowered expectations hadn't been met. When the old man walked in and started insulting everybody, he just knew that he was going to be that kind of drunk. Ninja often got stuck with two kinds of drunk. 1. The overly friendly kind of drunk that was a constant annoyance, and 2. The less than friendly kind that was a constant test of one's self-control. As they say, however, the customer is always right, and if you go killing the customers for pissing you off, they'll start taking their money elsewhere, and you'll start starving because you'll be out of business. After being put on a last pick of the day mission and meeting his drunken client, it was only natural that he'd been in a decidedly homicidal mood when he went home to pack. If it hadn't been for Suzume teaching him how to make storage seals, choosing what to bring with him would have been a much more difficult decision. Aside from his storage seals and explosive tags, he was pretty much hopeless at seals. Sure, he could recognize them for what they were, and make an educated guess at their purpose, but making them himself was almost completely beyond him. It had been through sheer repetition that he had become as proficient at the seals he was good at making as he was. Once he was done packing and hiding his valuables in case Satoshi dropped by while he was away, he left his apartment key, rooftop greenhouse key, and the list of trap locations with Suzume so she could tend to his plants while he was gone. The reason he'd chosen Suzume was because he was reasonably certain that with her, he would come back to find everything where he left it. With Satoshi, he'd be spending his mission pay getting his more important belongings out of Hawk, as the boy still hadn't learned his lesson and had to be a gambling-addicted kleptomaniac or something. With Tetsuo-sensei, he'd probably come home to find that the man had taken the opportunity to retaliate for one of his more good-natured pranks. He'd been stuck with purple hair for a week after the last time Tetsuo-sensei had gotten back at him for a prank. Sasuke growled as he packed for his mission, not in the least bit happy with the situation. Since they would be leaving bright and early the next morning, he wouldn't have time to do it then. He was going on his first C-ranked mission and, while that would normally be considered a good thing as it was a sign that he was moving up in the world, if only very slightly, he was only going because Kakashi thought that he was bored. Contrary to the way things should be, he wasn't taking a more difficult mission on the basis of his own merit but because Kakashi had wanted to please that boy. He had worked hard for years, trained for endless hours, studied for days on end, and, in under an hour, that boy came along and made a mockery of everything he'd worked for, and showed him how little he had gained through his efforts. What was worse was that that boy constantly refused to give him his all so he could grow stronger, surpass him, and prove his superiority. Despite all of his attempts to get him to do otherwise, that boy refused to take him seriously, treating him like he was something to play with to fill the empty hours while he was held back. To add insult to injury, every time that boy held back against him, he would make some stupid excuse for why he hadn't taken him seriously, just like he used to do back at the academy. Since they were usually about him when he was in the vicinity and often brought up things he didn't want to think about, he usually ignored the whispers around town. But, sometime around January, he'd heard the same thing being whispered over and over by the shinobi he'd passed, something that, rather than being about him as usual, was about that boy. For several weeks, he had heard constant repetitions of, "Why isn't he in the Chunin exams?" And ever since the Chunin exams had completely passed until July, he'd been hearing, "He should be a Chunin already." This of course was all Kakashi's fault. The whispers, the fact that that boy was playing with him, the insults to his pride, everything. For whatever reason, Kakashi was holding that boy back, and he was stuck paying for it. Sakura brushed her hair before bed. She was exceedingly nervous about the mission that was ahead of her. While it wouldn't be her first time outside of Konoha, it would be her first time as a ninja, and her first time in a foreign country, and she'd be going there with Naruto. While they were gone, there would only be Sasuke and Kakashi there to save her should Naruto finally snap like he had been looking like he was about to do for months. Naruto had apologized for the threat he'd made shortly after they became teammates, and told her that he would never harm his comrades, but still, the fear was there. She had read the statistics on shinobi who had suffered a break in the field and attacked everyone around them instead of just the enemy. Being a ninja was a high-risk and extremely stressful job which came with a burnout rate that was much higher than in just about every other career field. The number of psychotic breaks suffered by shinobi were proportionately higher as well. Over the last few months she had also read up on ways to detect the signs that a shinobi was under an unusually high amount of pressure and therefore at risk of suffering a psychotic break. Naruto was displaying several of these signs, and had been displaying them for as long as he'd been on the team. While snappishness by itself was considered a minor character flaw, snappishness combined with extreme irritability and restlessness were warning signs of something even more serious. Naruto may have promised never to harm her or any of his other comrades, but that was no guarantee. He had snapped before, and he could do it again at any time, and she could quite easily be one of the casualties due to proximity. After she finished brushing her hair, she checked her pack once more. She had packed it according to the academy guide, so it should be fine, but it was something to do to keep her mind off other things. After she finished checking her pack, she climbed under the covers of her bed in hopes she would get at least some sleep before she was due to leave for her first C-ranked mission. Tazuna gulped down his drink, hoping to drown out the overwhelming feeling of guilt he was currently experiencing. While he had never been a shinobi, his Uzumaki cousin on his mother's side had been, and he had learned some things from the older boy before he had died on a mission. One of the things he'd learned that had stuck with him over the years was how missions were handed out. When he'd fudged the mission ranking on his request, he had fully expected to get a team of Chunin. C ranks were usually reserved for Chunin, and only after the Chunin had made their pick were any remaining C ranks given to the more experienced Genin teams. Instead of being given a team of Chunin who might have been able to deal with Gato's mercenaries in a pinch, he'd been given a Genin team that looked as if it had just graduated from the academy. While a Genin team had a Junin on it, which would normally be a plus since Junin were rumored to be worth 10 Chunin, the man would be handicapped by his need to protect his Genin, and wouldn't nearly be as effective as he would otherwise have been. This was especially bad in this situation because the unsuspecting team would be walking into a great deal more danger than they signed up for. It was too late to turn back now, however. What was done was done. If he went back and admitted his lie, he and his people would not get the help they needed, and there was a possibility that he would become a guest of the torture and interrogations department, as shinobi villages didn't take too kindly to people deliberately misrunking their missions, and tended to become suspicious of their motives for doing so. He had come to Konoha because they had once been an ally and, in hindsight, that had made his betrayal only that much worse. So, he drank to forget the guilt of his actions as well as the worry over what would happen to his family and friends if help didn't come. The team had been several hours out when the first bit of trouble began. When the fighting started, Sasuke had raced headlong into danger without a plan after Kakashi had Kawarami'd out just as Naruto had expected he would, and Sakura held back too frightened to scream. As he'd half expected he would have to, Naruto had been forced to come up with a plan on the fly to deal with this. Eventually, he and Sasuke, who had been pretty much acting on his own while he compensated, had brought the two renegade Chunin down, and Kakashi had learned who their target was. When Kakashi had confronted Tazuna about his deception regarding the mission's actual difficulty, Tazuna had informed him that Wave had been virtually taken over by a shipping magnate who had bought up all of the ports, and that he was a threat to the man's rule because he'd been building a bridge to the mainland that he had refused to sell. The shipping magnate, whose name was Gato, had arranged to have him killed in hopes of forcing his heirs to sell his shares in a bridge that he actually pretty much owned in name alone, as he had contractually promised all of the shares to the workers after the completion of the bridge in exchange for their work, as he had only been able to pay them very little in the way of wages. Honestly, thanks to the incident with the Demon Brothers, Naruto's first instinct upon hearing this had been to turn back, but he knew that he couldn't turn his back on his mother's former homeland and say, "Well, the mission's beyond my pay grade, so bye." While he had been with Tetsuo-sensei, the man had made him read the newspaper every morning in order to improve his reading skills and make him get into the habit of keeping himself up to date on current events, which he had previously been almost completely oblivious to. While reading the paper, he had occasionally come across stories about stalled investigations into Gato's businesses, including a recent article about a minor port town in the land of tea that the man had recently bought outright. While reading these stories, he had read between the lines as Tetsuo-sensei had taught him to, and he had come to the conclusion that the man was a complete jerk who destroyed every place in which he set up business. Apparently, his mother's former homeland was next on the list. So, when Kakashi actually took a vote rather than unilaterally deciding on their course of action as a Junin in charge of a team of Genin was supposed to do, he found himself voting to continue onward. Even if it hadn't been his mother's homeland, he would have wanted to do something about what was going on there. If people like Gato were allowed to go unchecked, they ended up causing trouble in one's own backyard rather than the neighbors, and Wave was pretty damn close to Fire Country. Close enough to build a bridge to. In fact, he would have to start planning how he would be dealing with what lay in wait for him and his team on the road ahead soon. He was best at planning on the fly, but he wasn't too bad at long-range planning either. Tetsuo-sensei had taught him how to use his skill in planning pranks to plan battles beforehand, and that had helped him greatly in the past when dealing with bandits. While no plan survived contact with the enemy, the general shape of the plan usually did. And, if he had a general idea where his teammates would be ahead of time, he would have a general idea as to where on the battlefield to set up traps on the fly if he got the opportunity. It wouldn't do to catch your teammates in traps meant for the enemy after all. The kind of battle where he would have to fight his way through completely capable opponents because he hadn't been able to set any traps up beforehand was his least favorite kind of fight. Beggars can't be choosers, and it was going to be the sort of fight he and his team were going to be engaged in when the next ninja came after Tezuna's head. However, he had been right back at the mission assignment desk. This mission was going to suck royally. Even though it was well out of his way, Haku had made it a point to pass by this place whenever he was in Wave. Zabuza had shown it to him years ago when they had passed through the small island country on the way to the mainland when they had fled from Kiri after the failed coup. To Zabuza, this place had been a reminder of how greatness could fall with few to mark its passing. To him though, this place had held a haunting and melancholy beauty that had spoken of how quickly things could end when you least expect them to. Though some household goods still remained moldering in homes that had not been lived in decades, time and rain had washed away all of the blood and most of the memories of this place. And now, pretty much all that was left to mark the existence of the once proud Uzushiyogakure was a series of partially cannibalized ruins that stretched down to the sea. He could not stay here long this time however because their target was due to arrive in Wave soon, and he and Zabuza were going to intercept him before he reached his home. Despite their employer's suggestions, they would not be attacking the target's family unless it became absolutely necessary to do so. 1. It had not been included in their contract, and 2. As well as being wrong for several reasons, it was also the sort of action that would breed ill will amongst the locals, which would in turn make them more willing to cooperate with any hunter nin who might have picked up their trail. As long as he and Zabuza left the locals alone, the locals would pretty much ignore their presence. That was the usual arrangement that people outside of the hidden villages tended to have with missing nin unless the nuke nin in question went and started making trouble. There were more than enough problems in life without attracting attention to oneself by turning someone who was probably only rogue due to some political issue over to the authorities. If they weren't hurting anybody, it usually wasn't worth the trouble. Staring at the ruins again? Zabuza asked when he finally rejoined him. I was Zabuza-sama, he replied as he picked up his mask and equipment pouch and prepared to depart. I honestly don't know what you see in them, Zabuza muttered as he checked his own equipment. Not that there was much of it, because times had gotten a little tough lately, and it was rather difficult to find a reasonably priced supplier who would sell to missing nin without turning them in. As soon as they were ready to go, they headed to the pre-selected ambush point and settled down for what could be a long wait. Most of the time on these types of missions, there was a lot of hurry up and wait, as targets had sometimes passed by ninja who had based the timing of their ambush on their target's ETA and delayed arriving accordingly only to find that the target in question had already passed through the pre-selected zone. Therefore, it was always prudent to arrive early to an ambush in case the target arrived earlier than expected. While he waited for the target to show, he killed some time by feeding Yuki, who was feeling restless at being cooped up in a tiny cage rather than in the small pen he'd built for the rabbit when they had arrived in Wave a couple weeks back. When the time came, Yuki would be released for Zabuza-sama to switch with if necessary. Until then, the rabbit was both his pet and his responsibility. Kakashi sighed as he watched his team who were bickering once more as they trailed behind him. Naruto had attempted to hold a silent conversation with his teammates, and became frustrated when they didn't understand, or rather when Sakura hadn't understood and Sasuke had refused to respond. Over the decades, shinobi hand signs had evolved into a separate language that was practically every ninja's second language. As well as the universal shinobi language that was most frequently used on joint missions, each village had its own language that had developed from their standard hand signs, and just about every clan had created its own dialect. When a civilian born or raised shinobi learned the language both universal and local from their teammates, they usually picked up inflections and sign variations from the dominant clan on the team. The dominant clan on Naruto's team, which was more of a family actually, had been the Shimura, which made Naruto's distinct Uchiha accent all the more puzzling. Rather than attempting to chat without the sensei overhearing as most genin tried to do at some point during their careers, Naruto had been trying to relay a slightly complicated battle plan that had involved team positions to the rest of the team. As far as he was concerned, Naruto had been perfectly intelligible despite his use of several unconventional signs, including a few slightly vulgar ones which were almost exclusively used by one of Konoha's street gangs. Sakura had not understood him at all however and, after initially giving him a briefly puzzled look, Sasuke had refused to respond when Naruto had asked him a couple questions about his preferred range of combat in order to refine his plan. After failing to receive the response he'd expected, Naruto had snapped at the other two, which had led to an argument, which had somehow led to Naruto finally losing his last shred of patience with Sakura and loudly listing what were in his opinion every last one of Sakura's failings, which had led to a vicious row between the two of them that had eventually de-escalated to the usual bickering. Except that Sakura was now in the mix rather than silently hanging back and occasionally chiming in her support for Sasuke like she usually did. If this continued, he might have to let Sasuke and Sakura go. He may be the only person in the village who could teach Sasuke how to use his Sharingan if or when it finally manifested, but he didn't really have to be the boy's teacher full-time to do so. More than enough Junin and Tokubetsu Junin had made apprenticeship offers for the boy, so it wasn't like the Uchiha would go without being trained in everything else. Sasuke seemed to do better with one-on-one training anyway. He also knew a pretty good, by the book, Tokubetsu Junin who might like to have Sakura, since he now had some free time on his hands because his student was attending the academy. The girl could be trained to be a private tutor or an academy instructor, since she seemed to know all of the books by heart and seemed to take great pleasure in imparting that knowledge. As he walked in formation with his team, Sasuke watched Kakashi and that boy communicate. The argument they'd been engaged in earlier had turned to cold silence after that boy and Sakura finished snipping at each other after that boy criticized Sakura's textbook perfect performance in everything she did, and told her that she was quite likely going to get herself killed by a ninja who had bought the academy texts off the black market if she continued to religiously adhere to the academy curriculum rather than develop her own style. Now, Kakashi and that boy were holding a conversation completely in hand signs. While this normally wouldn't be of interest to him, he had noticed that the two of them were using a number of signs that had been exclusively used internally within his clan throughout the conversation. "Where did you learn?" He finally signed to the two when his curiosity had gotten the best of him. He could tell that he was seriously rusty, but then again, he hadn't been able to communicate this way with anyone in years. Kakashi replied with what was obviously a personal call sign, since the man couldn't possibly have learned the Uchiha signs from a piece of eyewear. He wasn't familiar with that call sign however, but then again, he hadn't known the call signs of everyone in the clan. That boy signed back older boy show once. "Watch people's hands, watch police, so you know when to run." He'd learned the Uchiha signs just by watching? And, now that he thought about it, what the hell had he been running from the police for? "Why you not answer earlier?" That boy signed, still upset at his prior lack of response. The reason he hadn't answered that boy earlier had been out of embarrassment, not that he'd ever tell him. He hadn't communicated this way for years, and hadn't been all that fluent as he'd only been learning for about a year or so when he stopped. Naturally, he'd forgotten a number of the signs over the years since he'd had no one to talk to since he was 8, and hadn't needed anything more than the standard signs that were taught in the academy since then. As if just to show how much better he was, that boy had of course revealed that he was extremely fluent, and had an idiomatic grasp of the language. When he'd realized he'd only partially understood what that boy had been saying, and that he'd forgotten the sign for close to mid-range, he had decided to remain silent rather than reveal his ignorance. He would of course continue to remain silent on that matter, as revealing his ignorance would only cause him even greater embarrassment now. Sakura watched Sasuke, Kakashi and Naruto communicate and felt a little jealous over the fact that she was being left out once more. When Naruto had tried to communicate with her earlier, it had taken her a full minute to even realize that that had been what he was doing. It had been the attack, defend, and location signs that she'd learned at the academy that had finally clued her in. Ino Pig had started to teach her some sort of language that involved the academy hand signs years ago, but she had quit when they had decided to become rivals. She still remembered some signs like flower and tree though, none of which Naruto had used. After a while, Sasuke stopped communicating, and nothing Naruto did would get him signing again. Eventually, Naruto gave up. After Naruto gave up on Sasuke, Kakashi started a private conversation with Naruto, and she understood absolutely none of it. After a long period of silent communication, Kakashi looked back at her and started signing something. Naruto looked upset and signed something back. Kakashi replied by repeating what he'd signed earlier. Looking rather put upon, Naruto turned and walked back to her, muttering under his breath the entire time. "What signs do you know?" Naruto snapped when he reached her. She went through all of the academy signs, starting with the 12 basic hand seals used in jutsu and continuing through the ones meant to alert someone to the presence of the enemy or convey the most basic elements for a plan of attack. Namely, a set of numbers, a distance indicator, centimeters, meters, kilometers, the cardinal directions, over there. Wait for time interval of x, hours, minutes, seconds, at x time, hide, defend, retreat, and attack. Crap, Naruto moaned. I've really got my work cut out for me. Did Naruto mean what she thought he meant? Naruto looked around, but still seemed hesitant for some reason. Kakashi signed an affirmative, and he relaxed slightly. Okay, here are the basic kana. Naruto said as he began a series of 48 signs. Sasuke had been completely amazed by the sight of the incomplete bridge that would soon connect Wave to the mainland and therefore had had a hard time hiding his reaction to that amazement. He succeeded, however, if only just. A good shinobi never showed his emotions, and he was determined to be an even better shinobi than that man had been. Upon first catching sight of the bridge, Sakura had gasped in amazement and quietly complimented Tazuna. That boy, however. Damn it, why didn't I think of that earlier? That boy grumbled before digging in his pack and pulling out a shirt that was a shade of orange that was almost brown. Sasuke, take that shirt off. That boy said. Why? He asked. Other than the old saying, if you see a fan, go for the eyes. That boy replied. I don't want the enemy to know that there's another prize on the team, which will happen if you drop that pack of yours. You're still small enough to be portable, and almost of breeding age, which means you'll fetch a good price on the black market. Tetsuo-sensei nearly got himself killed last year recovering a girl from one of the lesser clans, and we don't need a problem like that on top of all the problems this mission already has. Seeing that his teammate's logic was sound in this instance, he quickly pulled his shirt off and accepted the orange one that boy had offered even though it wasn't his favorite color. He'd heard the horror stories when he was little, and they'd given him nightmares. Back before the massacre, his elder cousins had delighted in telling him stories of Uchiha being blinded in battle, and of Uchiha children being stolen in the night. Despite the fact that he didn't have a clan to protect him and retrieve him should he be taken anymore, he had not even once considered the possibility of either happening to him while on this mission. That boy who had never had a clan or a bloodline, and had never faced the possibility of such things happening to him and therefore should be mostly unaware of the risk obviously had, however. As he carefully folded his shirt making sure the Uchiha clan symbol was both on the outside and unfolded and put it in his pack, that boy held his hand out to Sakura expectantly. What? Sakura finally asked when that boy made an impatient gimme gesture. Fan club pin, that boy said, as he made the Uchiha clan general call sign, obviously still trying to teach Sakura the language, though why he had made that sign instead of the sign for pin, he didn't know. The girl rather reluctantly pulled something out of one of the hidden pockets on her dress and handed it to that boy, looking very unhappy to be doing so. Where the hell did you get this? This thing is a collector's item. That boy said as he turned the object over in his hands. My grandmother's stuff. Mom let me have it after she died. The girl said in a mumble, looking slightly embarrassed. What is it? He asked. One of the original Uchiha Izuna fan club pins from back before the founding. You can tell by the craftsmanship that indicates that it comes from the land of iron rather than Konoha and the odd marking on the back. The ones for the Madara fan club had a different marking, and the ones for your fan club are Konoha made, of a cheaper metal, and don't have a marking. I started collecting the damn things after I got a Madara pin from Tetsuo-sensei for my 11th birthday along with a copy of his trap book. I have no idea where he got it though because, The people who kept them all these years generally aren't willing to part with them since they're practically family heirlooms at this point. That boy said as he handed it to him. It'll be far less obvious than that giant fan on your back, but still allow you to hold to the tradition of wearing your clan standard into battle. Pin it to your collar. How do you know about that tradition? He asked as he complied, a little dubiously, considering the origins of the pin. You are currently wearing the Uzumaki spiral, Naruto said as he pointed to a design that was of a blood-red shinobi spiral that looked to be set into a target of some sort that was on the right sleeve of the shirt he was wearing. You do realize, Naruto, that by allowing Sasuke to wear your clan symbol, you've adopted him into your clan, don't you? Kakashi called over lazily from the back of the boat. I what? That boy yelled. Momochi Zabuza resisted the urge to shift impatiently. After hours and hours of waiting, his target was, very slowly in his opinion, coming up the road with his escort. He counted 3 genin and a very familiar-looking silver-haired Junin. As he looked over the team that was approaching, he assessed his opponents. He would have to watch out for the pink-haired one, as unusual hair colors were almost always a sign of a Kekkei Genkei of some sort. He might have to watch out for the blonde one as well, considering the facial markings that looked to have been tattooed onto his cheeks, since such tattoos on kids that age were a sign of them belonging to a ninja clan. The black-haired one was of least concern. As he was sizing up his opponents, the blonde-haired one started sniffing the air, and turned slightly in his direction. The boy hadn't been obvious about it, but he'd seen that method of tracking often enough to recognize it. He'd encountered members of a tattooed ninja clan in Konoha whose behavior matched that of the boy a number of times before, and had barely escaped with his life each time he'd done so. The boy was obviously an Inuzuka, though why he didn't have a dog with him. Perhaps it was ill and had to be left at home. As he watched, the blonde Inuzuka's hand moved toward the kunai pouch that had been strapped to his leg. He'd been made. He quickly switched places with Haku's rabbit an instant before the kunai went sailing through the spot he'd previously occupied. The team went to investigate immediately afterward, and only found the distraction. Naruto, why did you attack that poor defenseless rabbit? The pink-haired girl asked, sounding horrified. It smells like people, the unfortunately named Inuzuka replied. Knowing that he'd lost the advantage of surprise, he prepared to make his attack. Despite the natures of the man's students, his main opponent would be Sharingan Kakashi the copy ninja. In a battle such as the upcoming one, the genin would be little more than a distraction. Fortunately for him, the genin would be a distraction to the Hitaki as well, a distraction he'd be forced to protect, tipping the balance in his favor. It was time for him to make his entrance. A properly dramatic entrance that was made when his opponents were expecting a stealthy attack from behind, usually threw his opponents off balance, tipping the battle more firmly in his favor. With that in mind, he decided that dramatic entrance number 6 was best for this situation. As soon as the opportunity presented itself, he sent his sword flying across the clearing that the Hitaki and his genin team were standing in to bury itself in the trunk of a tree, and leapt onto the extended handle when it had, landing with his back facing the audience. Based on the reaction of the target and the genin, his entry had been flawlessly executed. Now for the show. Tazuna discreetly checked to make sure he hadn't wet himself. He hadn't. Good. He was glad that was over. It had been a very long time since he'd last had the misfortune of witnessing a ninja battle close up. He had forgotten the sheer terror and confusion that was involved as the impossible happened right in front of one's eyes with potentially deadly results. He hadn't really understood what had been going on, and therefore wouldn't be the best witness to ask if one wanted the story of what had happened during the battle between what were obviously two legendary ninja later. They'd been walking along the road when the Uzumaki who had been reminding him of his dead cousin the entire trip, why had Konoha sent him, had suddenly attacked a rabbit out of the blue, saying that it smelled like people. Considering the fact that he'd been sniffing the air like a dog while they'd been in the boat, he shouldn't have been surprised, much less doubtful that his sense of smell was that acute, but he still had been. Then, suddenly, there was a flying sword which had nearly taken his head off before it buried itself halfway into a tree. The gray-haired guy moved to confront the guy who had jumped on the sword that was now in the tree after that, and the 3 kids had moved to protect him. The enemy ninja, who was wearing gray button-fly pants and cow print arm and leg warmers and had his face covered in bandages, jumped onto the water and made a bunch of mist after the gray-haired man had pulled up his headband and revealed that he actually had two eyes, though the other one didn't match. Then, things got really weird, scary, and dangerous. Weapons went flying everywhere as the two men repeatedly turned into water, and then the Uzumaki suddenly multiplied and started setting traps everywhere. The black-haired boy joined the fray at this point and got injured somehow. At some other point during the battle, he found himself in the bushes while a copy of himself blew up in the enemy ninja's face. Then, the two men who'd started the fight got into some sort of jutsu contest and started making water dragons that tried to eat each other or something, and sent water flying everywhere. The battle eventually ended when a hunter nin from Kiri showed up, killed the demon guy who'd apparently gone on a homicidal rampage when he was a kid and killed the entire student body of a school, and left with the body. Afterward, the gray-haired guy collapsed, and the Uzumaki somehow made two of his clones turn into stretchers on which he placed the gray-haired guy and the black-haired boy. You're going to get yourself killed one day if you keep leaping into danger without any forward planning, Sasuke. The Uzumaki said as two of his clones carried the stretcher towards the road. Sometimes doing so is a good thing, since if you don't have any plans, nobody can anticipate them, but most of the time it isn't. You're damn lucky that Zabuza guy had just been messing around with you. You would have been dead otherwise. And, with that, the battle was completely over, and they made their way to his home and the possibility of a home-cooked, if somewhat meager, meal, and some medical attention for the injured members of their party. Fortunately, Tsunami had picked up some top-notch first aid skills thanks to some of the more daring antics of her first husband, who had been an adrenaline junkie who had gotten himself killed in a water skiing accident. He'd honestly expected the man to die during one of his base jumps, and had made several bets to that effect which he had lost. He hadn't been very fond of the man, but Tsunami, who had been young and head over heels in love with him, had refused to listen to his advice, and married him anyways. When the man had finally died, he'd left her alone with a newborn Inari and a mountain of debt that had forced her to move back in with him. Kaiza had been a much better son-in-law, husband, and father, even if he couldn't afford his own home and constantly mooched off of him. Sakura was torn between worry for her sensei and worry for Sasuke. Neither of the two had come away from the battle with the missing nin unscathed. Kakashi sensei was suffering from a very severe bout of chakra exhaustion, and Sasuke had a broken arm and a concussion. As he watched him sleep, Naruto had confided in her that there was a possibility that Kakashi-sensei wouldn't make it through the night. If it hadn't been for Naruto's quick thinking, there was a good chance that Sasuke would be dead right now instead of merely wounded. Despite the fact that Naruto hated Sasuke and normally didn't want anything to do with him, he had risked his life to save him. When she had asked Naruto why, he'd said, "Those who break the rules are trash. Those who abandon their teammates are worse than trash. Sasuke is my teammate, and no matter what I feel about him, I won't leave him behind." She didn't know what to think of that. Naruto hated them, and didn't want to work with them, but would risk his life to save them in a heartbeat. Would she be willing to risk her life to save someone she hated? Would she stand up to a much stronger enemy and use herself as a distraction, knowing that there was a good chance she dies so Ino, for instance, could get away? When she was little, she'd wanted to be a ninja like those guys in the animal masks she'd sometimes seen around the village. She had joined the academy, where her motive changed from becoming one of the animal mask people to impressing Ino, who had protected her from a group of bullies, and then later changed to impressing Sasuke. When she graduated, neither of them were impressed. Was this what being a ninja was? Possibly sacrificing yourself for someone you hate so the mission could be completed? Inside the village, she'd been cool, she'd been awesome, she'd been on the fast track to becoming the future Mrs. Uchiha. People had looked up to her. Outside the village, however, she'd been a minor annoyance to the enemy, a bug to be swatted, a bug that would have been swatted if her sensei and her teammates hadn't been there. Seeing that it was possible, she realized that she didn't want to be crushed or swatted. Right now, however, considering the fact that she couldn't even come close to measuring up to Sasuke, who was the second weakest member of the team, there was a distinct possibility of that happening. Naruto felt slightly worried as he watched Kakashi sleep. While there was a very good chance he'd wake up, there was also a slight possibility that instead of evening out, his breathing would slow and eventually stop. Severe cases of chakra exhaustion like the one Kakashi had were weird like that. While he was currently very upset with the man, Kakashi was still on his list of precious people if only just, and he didn't want him to die. Sasuke had already been seen to Tazuna's daughter Tsunami, who was a very capable woman who apparently knew the correct way to set and splint broken arms, and deal with a concussion, had seen to that earlier. Unlike Kakashi, he had little fear that Sasuke's condition would get worse, unless the Uchiha ran off and did something stupid. All that was left for the team to do now was to rest, guard the house in case Gato had hired someone else, and wait for Kakashi to wake up. Much to the relief of Naruto, who had spent the night keeping vigil at his bedside, Kakashi awoke the next morning. No matter what he felt about them at any given time, the people of Konoha were his responsibility to protect, the ninja of Konoha that he served alongside were his responsibility to bring home, and the people who truly cared about him were his precious people whom he'd do just about anything for. Having any one of them die on his watch while there was something he could have possibly done to prevent it was unacceptable. He had been very angry with Kakashi for the last several months. The man knew him, knew that he already had a sensei, and yet he still took him despite this. After apologizing for the irresponsible manner in which he had taught him Kage Bunshin 2 years ago, Kakashi had checked up on him occasionally between missions, and he would say hi to the man every time he saw him around the village, which was most often near the memorial stone which he visited to pay his respects to his mother and the Yondaime before heading over to Yamaguchi and Fujiwara's graves to say hi. When Kakashi almost died the night before because he had overexerted himself during the battle with that missing nin from Kiri, he had been feeling scared and regretful over the fact that they would have parted under such bad terms. Kakashi was one of his precious people, and he was one of the few people who hadn't given him that cold look the first time he met him. His being completely pissed off at the man didn't change that fact. Fortunately, Kakashi had pulled through, and his breathing had stopped being shaky and evened out to a more regular pattern that indicated he was asleep sometime around midnight. He still kept watch afterward just in case, and there had been no other signs of trouble since then, and Kakashi was showing signs of waking up. As Kakashi was opening his uncovered eye, he went to fetch Sasuke and Sakura, who would undoubtedly be happy to see that their sensei had actually woken up, even if Sasuke was currently feeling rather miserable despite the painkillers he'd given him earlier. The danger had passed. Kakashi was aware and moving around, which meant that he would live, though it would take him several days to recover. Soon, the three of them were seated at the man's bedside. As team leader, Kakashi would be the one to give them orders. Shit. Kakashi groaned once he was fully aware of his surroundings. An ominous feeling came over him. That wasn't the, "I did something exceedingly dangerous and now I'm paying for it, swear." That was the, "Crap, there's a distinct possibility that I royally screwed up. Swear." Not a good sign. Not a good sign at all. What? He asked, almost dreading the answer because, if Kakashi was so concerned over screwing up, something that was so beyond serious that it wasn't even funny had most likely gone wrong. That hunter nin took the body. Kakashi replied. He didn't know what the significance of this obviously significant statement was, and he didn't like not knowing. Not knowing meant that you were left out of the loop, which was a dangerous place to be if you were a ninja. As soon as he got back to Konoha, he would have to force himself to sit still long enough to read up on hunter ninja and their practices. Making sure he could read properly and know how to research any subject he needed to had been one of the best things Tetsuo-sensei had ever done for him. Hunter nin are supposed to dispose of the corpse right there, so foreign ninja can't intercept them and take the body from them in order to learn its secrets. Kakashi continued. Yeah, he was feeling like swearing too. They had let some 2-bit missing nin pull a con on them, and now they were in serious trouble because of it. That Zabuza guy was going to be coming back, and he'd be pissed as hell when he did. Ninja generally didn't like to lose, and especially didn't like being humiliated in front of a bunch of genin, or worse, in front of civilians. Zabuza had done both. Based on the technique the fake hunter nin used, and the damage Zabuza took, it will be several days before he is up and about. We've only got about a week to prepare for his next attack. Kakashi continued, summarizing his estimate of the situation. A week. Perfect. Now this was his favorite kind of fight. He would have to be careful with any of the traps he made though, as he didn't want the locals stumbling into them and getting themselves hurt. Perhaps something that would be set to only go off at the command of the setter then. Inari sat in his room staring at the picture of his father Kaiza. Unlike most times, he wasn't crying, he was thinking. Last night, shortly after grandfather had returned with the strangers, he had confronted them. "Gato's too strong. If you stand up to him, you're all going to die." He yelled at the kids who were only a few years older than him, and were about to throw their lives away for nothing. "If I die, then I die, but at least I go knowing I did my best to help." The blonde boy who was helping his mother fix up the dark-haired boy said. "Do you think you're a hero or something? There's no such thing as heroes." He'd yelled at the boy. There weren't any heroes. Heroes only lived in fairy tales, and the idiots who thought they were heroes always got themselves killed, leaving those they left behind to try to pick up the pieces. The blonde boy had looked at him and shook his head sadly. "There are heroes," the blonde boy said. "In real life, however, the hero doesn't always save everyone, and sometimes the hero's only reward for his actions is to go to the afterlife knowing that he had done his best, and hoping that someone will take up his banner and succeed where he had failed. I myself would rather die trying to save everyone than watch the people around me suffer without doing anything." Had his father really been a hero rather than a fool? Had his father gone to the afterlife with the same hope? Had he let the man who had vowed to raise him despite the fact that they weren't blood down? Grandpa had picked his father's banner up when it fell when he continued construction on the bridge despite all of the threats that had been made against him, and was going to pay the ultimate price because of it. Was it worth it though? Last night he would have said that it most definitely was not, and that the way of the world was that the strong crushed the weak, and that Gato was the strong and that anyone who went against him pointlessly wasted their lives. Now though, there was a small niggling doubt, a doubt that had been caused by the last thing the blonde boy had said as he was leaving the room. As he turned to run back to his room, the blonde boy had said, "Evil only flourishes when good men do nothing." He had been doing nothing for a long time, and had been urging others to do nothing as well. Had he been making Gato strong because of this? Gato hadn't seemed so strong until after Dad had died and everyone was afraid to do anything about it. Sakura sat there thinking as she tended to Kakashi after Naruto had told her to make herself useful. Unlike most of the time when she had all the free time she wanted to fantasize about becoming Mrs. Uchiha, she had great deal to think about. Last night, Naruto, who had gotten fed up with her once more, had asked her why she had even wanted to be a ninja in the first place, and she had answered him honestly, though she didn't know why. Instead of laughing at her naive childishness, he'd whistled and said, "Anbu? That's one tough goal, you'll probably make it though. You won't catch the Hokage's attention if you keep hanging back and expecting Sasuke to rescue you however." At this point, she wasn't sure she even wanted to become an ANBU, much less if she still wanted to be a ninja. As she was now, she was weak and could easily be killed if there was no one to jump in and do her fighting for her. But Naruto had honestly seemed to believe that she could become one of the village's most elite ninja who were hand-selected by the Hokage to serve him someday if she worked hard at it. He'd even gone so far as to lay out a plan for her to be able to reach her goal. Strange, it wasn't until then that she'd realized that she didn't have any goals in life other than to become Mrs. Uchiha. What came after she attained that goal? Babies? And, what else? What would she do to fill her time when Sasuke was out on missions? What would she do if Sasuke died on one? What would there be after Sasuke? Becoming an Anbu and life after Sasuke weren't the only things she had to think about though. She hadn't known if it was stupidity or courage that had made her do so, but she had asked Naruto why he had killed those two genin from Iwa. He told her, it hadn't been because they had blocked his promotion as she'd spent the last several months believing. If she'd seen two of her classmates, or even any two ninja she'd met say, the week before be killed in front of her, would she do what Naruto had done? Would she lose it so completely that she wouldn't even realize that the people responsible for killing her comrades were dead until long after their broken and bleeding bodies had fallen to the ground? She had heard so many times that the life of a ninja was one that was filled with pain and death while she was in the academy, but she truly hadn't begun to realize what that had meant until now. It was too late to turn back however. She'd signed a 5-year service agreement when she had earned her spot on the team, instead of the 1-year provisional agreement that had been recommended. The only way she could get out now is if they kicked her out, and ninja who got kicked out were held in contempt in Konoha. If she were dismissed, she would have to move and leave everything she knew behind if she didn't want to live as an outcast. Sasuke too was thinking despite the headache from the concussion, but it wasn't about his goals and ambitions. He'd asked Kakashi where he'd gotten his Sharingan eye, and the man had refused to answer. An expression that looked like a cross between guilt and grief crossed what little he could see of the man's face before he'd turned his back to him and dismissed him. Certain that he would know, considering the fact that he seemed to know any number of things he shouldn't, he'd then gone to that boy for the answers Kakashi had refused to give him. That boy had indeed known as he'd suspected he would. "I heard what everyone knows from Tetsuo-sensei," that boy said. Back during the war, Kakashi was on a team with an Uchiha named Obito. Something went seriously wrong during a mission, and Kakashi came back with the eye, a missing teammate, even more issues than he'd left with, and a new habit that had caused Obito Time to be renamed Kakashi Time. Since the clan had been alive at the time and would have demanded the man's head on a plate if that had been what happened, he knew that Kakashi hadn't stolen his teammate's eye. The answer to how he'd gotten it then was that Obito had given it to him. Why would Obito have done something like that? Why would he give one of his eyes, knowing that he risked never finding the right path on his journey through the afterlife? Kakashi had not even been blood, he'd just been a teammate. Kakashi struggled to sit up. It was a difficult task, however. He was tired and his muscles refused to cooperate. He needed to get up quickly though. He needed to start training his students for the coming confrontation as soon as possible, which would be just as soon as he could stand with or without assistance. He knew what he needed to start them on since he wouldn't be able to use his chakra or move around all that much for a while, and frankly he should have started it weeks ago considering the benefits the exercise held for the uninitiated, instead of wasting his time on completely pointless teamwork exercises. Naruto pretty much had this skill mastered already, so he would have to find something else for the boy to do. He did have a bit of spare testing paper on him that he'd won in a bet. Maybe he would start training the boy to harness his chakra affinity so he could more easily master elemental jutsu. He knew that the boy already had a couple wind jutsu in his arsenal, and they could become even more powerful where he trained. With that plan in mind, he lay back down. While it was a good thing to exert oneself, overdoing it was detrimental to one's well-being. As he lay there, he speculated on what Minato-sensei's son's elemental affinity would be. Would it be wind like his father, as the boy's small arsenal of elemental jutsu indicated, or would it be water like his mother? The boy looked like both parents and took after both parents, though he favored his mother in looks and behavior somewhat as that odd verbal tick indicated, so it would be interesting to find out which one he favored in that area. Unfortunately, even if Naruto possessed the ability, he had absolutely no idea as to how one would go about teaching the boy how to create the chakra chains that his mother had been able to create, which was a pity since Naruto could have used them to hold their opponent down while he beat him up. Naruto stared down at the piece of paper that Kakashi had given him dubiously. Kakashi had decided to test his elemental affinity out of the blue that morning. While a ninja could learn elemental jutsu that were outside of their affinity, even without knowing one's affinity, elemental jutsu that were of one's affinity were usually much easier to learn and that much more potent. Truly mastering one's affinity, especially to the point where one could manipulate chakra to transform it into that elemental nature, and possibly even create new jutsu, took years. Usually, a ninja started mastering their affinity when they made Chunin. Tetsuo-sensei had promised to test him the minute he got his vest, and help him master his affinity as soon as he knew what it was. Naruto's problem wasn't with any of that, as he'd been dying with curiosity to learn what his affinity was, and didn't think Tetsuo-sensei would mind too much if he took an early peek. The problem he had at the moment was with the chakra test paper itself. "And tell me again what happens if my affinity is fire?" he asked, hoping that he'd misheard Kakashi when the man had been explaining the different reactions that the special paper had to different chakra types. "The paper will burn," Kakashi replied. Yeah, that's what he thought he heard. The paper would burn, and it would be in his hand when that happened too. Considering the fact that the predominant affinity in Konoha was fire and the fact that he didn't know who his father was aside from the fact that he'd been a resident of Konoha. "Don't worry, it's perfectly safe," Kakashi said, trying to reassure him. It wasn't all that reassuring though. "How many of these things do you have on you?" he asked. "A few. Why?" Kakashi replied. "Here, Sasuke," he said as he handed his paper to the boy who had been looking at it with a jealous gleam in his eye. He'd seen the boy using fire jutsu with relative ease and, While that could be the result of early training by a fire-aligned family, it was more likely the result of an untested fire affinity. The instant he'd made his offer, the boy snatched the test paper from him almost greedily, and started to channel chakra into it as Kakashi had instructed him to do. Crinkle. FWOOSH. Ow. Sanuva. Stomp. 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 That pretty much had been what he had thought would happen. The double affinity was interesting though. Maybe it was an extra Kekkei Genkei, considering the fact that there were Kekkei Genkei that allowed people to mix two different elements to create a new, advanced, element. Double Kekkei Genkei had shown up in some families on occasion though. Usually when you tried to mix two Kekkei Genkei, all you got was a mess. At least, that's what he'd heard happened. He wondered what fire and lightning would make, other than a more effective way of destroying things that is. As soon as the first paper was finally disposed of by the Uchiha, Kakashi offered him a second piece of the test paper to replace the one he'd given to Sasuke. He didn't want to take it though. Watching someone else get burned by one of the things had been enough to make him definitely not want to risk it, rather than be somewhat cautious about doing so. Look Naruto, it's perfectly safe. Kakashi said, sounding slightly frustrated. Your mother's affinity was water, and therefore there is virtually no chance of you being a fire affinity since water is a dominant trait that drowns out fire roughly 999 times out of 1,000 in such pairings, and there is a very good chance that your father wasn't a fire affinity anyways. Why the hell hadn't he said so in the first place? If he just explained that earlier, Sasuke wouldn't have had to go through the trauma of having his fingers burned just now, and he wouldn't have had to go through the trauma of watching it happen. Well, at least Sasuke had gotten something out of the experience. Sighing, he took the paper and channeled chakra into it. It cut itself in two. Wind. Figured, since the few wind jutsu he'd learned had come to him much more easily than the fire jutsu he'd dubbed the arsonist's best friend that he'd picked up, and that one was a rather small flame that wasn't nearly as noticeable as the flashier and higher-ranking fire jutsu that some ninja had a habit of flinging about. Well, now that that's out of the way, I may as well start Sasuke and Sakura on their training before I show you the first exercise of your elemental training. Kakashi said. Sasuke and Sakura perked up at this slightly, as Kakashi turned his focus on them. Today you will be learning to climb trees. Kakashi said cheerfully. The instant Kakashi made that announcement, he found himself pitying Sasuke. That had been incredibly mean of the man. Most ninja tended to gather their chakra by using either the ram seal or a one-handed variant of it. Sasuke's left arm was broken and in an improvised cast, making the ram seal, and just about every other seal for that matter, impossible, and he had several burned fingers on the arm that wasn't broken, which would make forming the half-ram painfully difficult. Not only that, but he was suffering from the aftereffects of a concussion as well. Kakashi was clearly enjoying the dumbfounded looks his two students were giving him over the fact that they were finally going to learn the tree climbing exercise. Well, as far as he was concerned, it was about damn time. They said that each sensei had their own teaching style, but waiting 5 months before teaching one of the most basic chakra control exercises bordered on criminal. He himself had started learning it during his first few days under Tetsuo sensei. You'll be doing it without your hands, Kakashi said cheerfully in reply to Sakura's whine of, but I already know how to climb trees. Kakashi was definitely enjoying this like the sadistic bastard he was reputed to be. Poor Sasuke. Naruto here will demonstrate, Kakashi said, putting him on the spot. Great. Heaving a put-upon sigh, he walked up to the nearest tree and started walking up the trunk, which was bare of branches for about the first 30 feet or so in a spiral pattern. He then selected a branch that was in full view of the others and walked along its underside, stopping about midway. Both Sasuke and Sakura gaped up at him. Sasuke looked jealous of his rather pedestrian ability. Then again, Sasuke always looked either upset or jealous when he did something the other boy hadn't learned yet. To do this, you must concentrate your chakra onto the soles of your feet. Kakashi explained to his students. Too much and you crack the bark of the tree and fly off. Too little, and you won't stick. Use these to mark your progress, Kakashi said as he threw a pair of kunai into the ground in front of Sakura and Sasuke. Sasuke naturally had a great deal of difficulty with the exercise, which was completely understandable considering the condition he was in. Sakura, however, Sakura managed it perfectly the first time. Apparently the girl had near perfect to perfect chakra control. The medical corps would be drooling over her if they found out. The medical corps had suffered a severe drop in enlistment over the last few years because genjutsu had become a fashionable specialty amongst kunoichi, who were much more likely to have the perfect chakra control necessary for medical jutsu than their male counterparts. He knew this because medical corps had been after Suzume ever since she'd made Chunin. "You'd better hide Sakura when we get back to Konoha Kakashi, or the medical corps will try to steal her," he said half-jokingly after Sakura had made her way up the tree. Considering how desperate they were for qualified new recruits, he wouldn't be surprised if that actually happened. Sakura stared at Naruto from the high branch she was perched in. With an offhand remark, the boy had handed her an out she could take without disgracing herself or her family should she choose to do so. If she trained as a medic, she could work in the hospital, as in off the field and away from battle. Medics were highly prized, and retired medics could go into practice as medical doctors after a certain number of years of service as a medic should they choose to do so. If she became a medic, she would have the career she needed and the training she needed when she left the ninja life forever. Becoming a medic had another potential positive as well. If she decided that she didn't want to completely waste several years of effort she had put into becoming a kunoichi so far, and wanted to achieve the goal that had gotten her to attend the academy in the first place, instead of deciding to leave once or 5 years or however long it took to get her certification as a doctor were up however, medics would be valued amongst the Anbu as well. Someone would have to make sure the prisoner survived until it was brought in, or patch the team up if things went south. It may as well be her if it was anybody. Either way, training as a medic would be useful for her future whichever path she decided to take. That, and it would be useful when she was married to Sasuke, as she had learned that children sometimes got themselves into the serious sort of trouble where seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Statistics for this were especially high in ninja villages where one had the risk of accidentally stabbing oneself with a poisoned weapon or setting off an explosive tag accidentally added on top of the usual risks. Should she choose to become a medic on the path towards leaving the ninja life rather than on the path towards staying however, there was a slight hitch to this plan. Either her sensei would have to sign her up for the program if he felt her capable, or she would have to become a chunin in order to sign herself up if her sensei refused for whatever reason. Since there currently wasn't a surplus of genin, and the spring cycle class was evenly divisible by 3 as well, there was a good chance that Kakashi sensei wouldn't split the team up before they took the chunin exams, as Naruto had informed her that they needed a whole team to compete. Either way, the odds that she would have to take the Chunin exams were high and, if she did, she would have to do her damned hardest to pass, in case Kakashi-sensei refused to sign the forms releasing her from his team. Either path she chose, her life would not start until after the team entered the Chunin exams. Until then, she would have to learn all she could of the shinobi arts in order to pass the exams when the time came. Hopefully, she would be strong enough that she wouldn't be squashed as an afterthought by then. Sasuke growled as he tried once more to make his way up the tree. Once again, he didn't make it past a few feet, and most of the distance he'd attained had been more from the momentum he'd built up on the way to the tree. Sakura, who had never done this before, had been able to manage to make her way to the top of her tree perfectly the first time. Kakashi said it was because she had so little chakra that she was able to control it easily, but he wasn't too sure. He would do this however. He would master this to the point that he was better than that boy who had climbed his tree with the greatest of ease and hung upside down until Kakashi called him over for some special advanced training. As he struggled to climb the tree, he tried to figure out whether that boy had been playing with him or with Kakashi when he'd handed him that test paper. While it had made for a rather vicious prank as he'd gotten his fingers burned, he now knew his elemental affinity, or affinities rather. It was quite possible that he would not have learned them until much later if that boy who had already been certain of at least one of his affinities hadn't handed him that paper. What was that boy up to? Had that boy been trying to do him a favor, or was this the start of some twisted new game? Relax, Sasuke. That boy called over to him from near where he stood with Kakashi. It's a whole lot easier when you're not frustrated. You should stop a while, use one of the meditation techniques they taught at the academy, and try again. Stop and meditate? What the hell was that boy playing at? You should use Kage Bunshin on this exercise to get the most out of it. Kakashi said after he'd finished explaining the leaf-cutting exercise and its purpose to his student. But Tetsuo-sensei told me not to. Naruto replied. This reply naturally added to his frustration. Ever since Naruto had become his student, it had been Tetsuo-sensei this, and Tetsuo-sensei that. But Tetsuo-sensei said, seemed to be the boy's favorite phrase. Not once had he heard a Kakashi-sensei from the boy. He'd heard 100 yes sirs, but no yes Kakashi-sensei. He understood that Naruto was upset at being taken from his former sensei, but he would still like at least a little acknowledgement for his role in the boy's life. Why did Shimura tell you not to? He asked, wondering why the man would handicap Naruto's potential progress in such a manner. Using Kage Bunshin would allow the boy to learn things much faster, especially with the sheer number of shadow clones that the boy could create. What would normally take the boy years to learn could be whittled down to mere weeks or even days depending on the number of Kage Bunshin that were used. Naruto looked embarrassed and slightly guilty for some reason, as if his not being allowed to use Kage Bunshin for training had been his own failing and not his previous teachers. I made them study while I ran off to play once, and Tetsuo-sensei caught me. Naruto replied, as long as you are working alongside the Kage Bunshin, it should be fine. He said, resolving to have words with Shimura for hampering his student's progress due to a youthful error. Naruto gave him a look, but reluctantly complied. Reluctant compliance had been all he'd gotten out of the boy since day one. It was rather disheartening. He wouldn't quit trying, however, he'd get through to the boy eventually. He'd made a vow to teach Minato-sensei's son, as Minato-sensei had taught him, and by all of the gods in existence, he would do it, despite the fact that someone had seemed to have gotten there first. While Zabuza was not yet well enough to be up and about, he was well enough that he could be left alone for a few hours without worry, and Haku needed to restock his supply of medicinal herbs. It had been a few days since the fight with the copy ninja and his genin, and the paralysis and chakra exhaustion had nearly worn off. Zabuza would need some more bed rest though before he was fully recovered, but, in his current condition, he would easily be able to defend himself from any of Gato's 2-bit thugs, should they decide to bother him. After checking on his master, Haku dressed himself in his favorite outfit and prepared to head out. He knew about the comments that were made about the fact that he often dressed like a girl even when he did not need to disguise himself as such, and didn't particularly care. He knew he was a boy no matter how he looked or what he wore, and if he wanted to dress like a girl, that was his prerogative. Besides, this outfit was made from a more comfortable material than the ones he usually wore when there was the possibility of going into battle. And while pink wasn't his favorite color, he wasn't averse to wearing it. When he made his way to a clearing that he'd noted contained the plants he would need when he'd passed through it earlier, he found a boy lying on the ground asleep, looking as if he had collapsed from exhaustion where he stood, too tired to seek shelter. His first instinct when he'd come across the boy who had been dressed in a dark orange shirt that was decorated with the red spiral he'd seen on the Konoha shinobi uniforms on one of the sleeves, and one of the spiral in a target symbols that he'd seen scattered throughout Uzushigakure's ruins on the other had been to do whatever it took to protect Zabuza-sama. In this case, protecting Zabuza-sama would be to not allow the boy to get away and alert his companions to Zabuza-sama's likely survival if they weren't aware of the possibility already. Instead of killing the boy like he should have done, however, he yet again proved that he was too soft to truly be a shinobi and shook him awake. You shouldn't be sleeping out here, especially in your weakened condition. You could catch your death of cold. It's still March, you know, and a cold snap could come on suddenly, he said to the boy who had startled awake and scurried backward when he had realized who was shaking him. I don't care, the boy said. I have to train. I have to become stronger than him. I believe that you become truly strong when you have someone precious to protect, he said to the boy. He knew this to be the truth because he was at his strongest when he was protecting Zabuza-sama. While training was well and good, and training oneself into the ground on occasion built character, there was a point where it was too much, and it looked like the boy had taken it that far. He'd done so himself enough times to know that training to the point of collapse too often was counterproductive and left him weak at times when he needed to be strong enough to protect Zabuza-sama. The boy gave him a strange look that seemed to be disbelief coupled with something he couldn't quite identify in response to his statement. Do you have someone precious to you? Someone you'd do anything to protect? He asked the boy. Not anymore, the boy said. They're all gone. That man killed them. That threw him slightly. He'd been living with the impression that people in Konoha had lived easy lives where the worst one of their extremely coddled children had to face was an orphanage where they'd be fed for a long while. The boy in front of him though was like he had been before Zabuza-sama had found him and given him purpose, unhappy and completely alone. "I lost my precious people once," he said quietly, remembering the day when his father had killed his mother and he had killed his father and a number of the people in the small village he used to live in self-defense. "Someone found me, and gave me a reason to live. Someday, you'll find someone else, and you'll be happy again when you do." The boy gave him a dubious look, as if he didn't believe him and didn't want to believe him. It was true however, while he was still sad over the loss of his family and would always mourn the loss of his parents, he was happy he had Zabuza-sama. Zabuza needed him, and for as long as Zabuza-sama needed him, he would remain by his side serving him in every way he needed him to throughout good times and bad. "Let me look at that arm of yours," he said holding out his hand for the boy's broken arm which had been put in a temporary cast, deciding to change the subject to something a bit less deeply personal. While there was little to nothing he could do about the fact that all of the Konoha boy's precious people were gone, there was possibly something he could do about the boy's arm. Aside from knowing a great deal of herb lore, he had a few medical ninjutsu in his repertoire, and one of them was one that sped up the healing of broken bones considerably. The boy who was giving him a highly suspicious glare didn't look like he would cooperate with his request though. "I'm a fully trained medic," he said. That last statement had been slightly fudged but, he knew how to deal with broken bones, and had been forced to do so a couple days ago when he was tending to Zabuza after his battle with the copy ninja. He knew that he was taking a serious risk in doing this but, he couldn't just leave an injured person without trying to help, even if they were on the opposite side of a conflict he was involved in. The boy reluctantly complied, continuing to look at him suspiciously as if he expected him to stab him at any second. The boy clearly knew that he was in no shape to win any fight that would break out between them however, and had therefore refrained from attacking. He took the offered arm and gently examined it. It had been a clean break, and the bone had been properly set. Under such favorable conditions, there was very easily something he could do for the boy, and after using one of the few medical jutsu he knew, the bone was healed. "You should get back," he said when he was finished. "Your sensei is undoubtedly worried about you." With a grunted, "Thanks," the dark-haired boy left. He had no illusions that the boy wouldn't report him to his teacher. He would have to swiftly vacate the area and pick a different spot in which to gather the herbs he needed as quickly as he could so he could get back to Zabuza-sama as soon as possible. Aside from this and a nearby clearing, there was another clearing near the Uzushiogakure ruins that held the plants he was after as well. The clearing near the ruins seemed to be the safer choice, especially should the boy's teacher go looking for him rather than wait for him and Zabuza to come to them as they would be later on. After vacating the clearing which the Konoha genin had just departed, he made his way to the ruins to gather the herbs he needed. After he was done, he paused at the ruins as he customarily did while on his way back to Zabuza-sama despite the fact that tarrying in such a manner was inadvisable. It was there that he saw the blonde boy he met in Kiri and had seen again on the road escorting Zabuza-sama's target. He immediately recognized him because the boy was rather unforgettable with that wild blonde hair, and those whisker marks that looked to have been tattooed onto his cheeks. The boy was carrying a bouquet of wildflowers as he wandered through the ruins for some strange reason. As the boy moved through the ruins, he seemed to be searching for something rather than wandering aimlessly. He hoped that whatever the boy was searching for, it wasn't him because he wasn't in the mood to fight, and didn't want to be forced to kill the other ninja whom he was certain would recognize him for what he was, if he didn't recognize him for who he was. Some ninja had long memories and some didn't. Eventually, the boy made his way into the overgrown graveyard that was choked with weeds, and after searching around for a while, he stopped in the section that contained a number of graves belonging to a clan called Uzumaki. "My name is Uzumaki Naruto," the boy who had offered to treat him to dinner said loudly with a bright smile on his face as he fiddled with a pair of chopsticks, impatiently waiting for the old man to finish preparing his ramen. "I'm going to be the Hokage someday." As he watched from the shadows, the blonde boy summoned a number of kage bunshin and, after setting the bouquet down on a random headstone, he joined them in cleaning up the cemetery. He was almost tempted to join the boy in his task but, he refrained from doing so. If the Uzumaki child who he couldn't forget was a Konoha ninja didn't recognize him as the girl he'd met in Kiri, he would surely recognize the fact that he was a ninja, and they would be forced to fight. He didn't want to fight the blonde boy since the boy was in obvious good health, was an unknown quantity skill-wise considering how many cage bunshin he was capable of producing with minimal effort, and would be fully willing to attack him in order to protect his client as the outcome of the battle could potentially be in his favor. He had gotten lucky with the dark-haired boy who had been suffering from a mild case of chakra exhaustion on top of his other injuries earlier, and he knew it. He didn't believe that his luck would hold twice in one day. "I don't know which of you guys are my grandparents, but I'll bring flowers for all of you later," the Uzumaki boy said as he picked the bouquet of flowers back up when he and his clones had finished clearing all of the weeds out of the cemetery. The boy then carried the flowers to the Killed in Action monument that was located near the center of the cemetery and laid them down before saying a brief prayer for the dead. Every shinobi village had such a monument, though they were never quite the same as, or in the same location as the memorials any other given village. Uzushiogakures was a slab of black granite which had been polished at one time, which had the symbol of the village and the names of the dead etched into it. Time had taken the shine off of it and begun to wear the names away, but they were still legible, and a large number of them had been Uzumaki. As he watched the boy pay his respects to his fallen relatives, he felt slightly guilty as if he were spying on something private. It was then that he realized that he had been trespassing in the home of this boy's ancestors for years without once properly paying his respects to the dead. While the Uzumaki's attention was turned elsewhere, he quietly left the cemetery, hoping the boy wouldn't notice that someone had intruded on his solitude. Naruto got up from where he had been kneeling in front of the Uzushio monument. He had had the feeling that he was being watched the entire time he'd been in the ruins of the former ninja village, but now it was gone. Whether that was because his ancestors had been appeased by his attempts to pay his respects or because someone had actually been watching him and only just left, he didn't know. He had asked Tazuna-san for directions to the village earlier this morning, and the old man had rather reluctantly given them to him. It seemed that people avoided this place, believing it to be haunted. He too had a fear of ghosts, and had been slightly nervous when he had felt someone watching him from the shadows and had been unable to see him or her. If it had been a spirit, they apparently weren't offended by his presence. To get here today, he had taken one of the sorts of breaks from training that would have had Tetsuo-sensei rip him a new one if he'd caught him doing it. He had left his cage bunshin to do all of the work while he went and did something else. Tetsuo-sensei had told him that leaving his cage bunshin behind to do all the work was an exceedingly stupid and lazy thing to do when he had caught him doing it, as he would get in the habit of foisting all of his tasks off on his clones and never really learn to do anything for himself because his clones would then become lazier as a result of him becoming lazier, starting a vicious cycle. But today, there had been some extenuating circumstances. He had wanted to pay his respects to the ancestors he had never known in case he didn't get a chance to do so later, and hadn't wanted to stop his training either. After setting his clones to the leaf-cutting task that they seemed to be close to accomplishing, he had set out to gather flowers as an offering as there had not been any to be bought in the small town near Tazuna's house. Once he had the flowers, he came here. The ruins of Uzushiogakure were a desolate and lonely place, and some of the buildings looked as if they had been scavenged for building materials. Considering the current economic situation and the price of such materials, he understood why the locals had done so and didn't begrudge them what they took, since it would be better for them to be of use to the living than to crumble to dust and be completely forgotten. At least, the people who had gone scavenging for building materials had had the decency to leave the graveyard and the monument alone. The only issue he had with that was that it had been left entirely alone, and it looked as if nobody had come to tend to any of the graves in years if not decades. Deciding that it was the least he could do, he summoned another batch of cage bunshin and weeded the place while the one he'd assigned as a scout went to look for the village's Kia memorial. He knew that every village had one, because he'd asked Tetsuo-sensei about it when he'd spotted Kiris before the start of the rather ill-fated Chunin exams. Eventually, the cemetery was cleared, the monument was found, he'd been able to pay his respects, and the strange presence that had been making him nervous had vanished. He didn't get very much time to ponder the reason behind the vanishing of the other presence. Considering the fact that one of the cage bunshin that had just dispelled had been informed by Kakashi that there had been some sort of incident with Sasuke earlier, he decided that it would be better to shelve that mystery for later and should head back to Tazuna's. Sasuke looked down at his arm once more. Someone who was his enemy, and therefore pretty much had an obligation to kill him, had healed him instead. Why? Why do something like that for a complete stranger that you would be fighting, if not then later? Had he healed him so he would have a better fight when the time came? Or had he really done it out of the kindness of his heart as he had appeared to have done? What the boy who had dressed like a girl had said about finding someone who would give him purpose and becoming happy again had bothered him as well. How would he ever be happy again with his entire family gone? Who would he find that would compare to the people he had lost? And, if he did find someone who compared, what would happen to that person if that man were still alive and found out about them? That man had told him that in order to get the eyes he needed to be able to come close to equaling him, he would have to kill the one closest to him. That would naturally be any precious person he found or who found him. Would he really kill his precious person after he found him or her in order to avenge his clan? Most disturbing to him was the fact that a part of himself had said yes. It would seem that to protect this precious person, whoever he or she may be, the best thing to do would be to never find them in order to protect them from himself. Naruto swore. The two bastards from about a week ago had shown up at least a day earlier than expected and in a place that had been completely unexpected considering the usual modus operandi of the sort of missing nin who were of a more mercenary bent. Rather than showing up in a place where they could cause a great deal of collateral damage which would have left the team scrabbling to protect innocent bystanders, they had turned up on a newly built section of bridge he hadn't gotten around to trapping yet because he'd run out of certain necessary materials and hadn't found ones he could use to jury-rig traps that would capture a ninja. He was now seriously regretting focusing more on Tezuna's home and the nearby village where he believed an attack more likely due to the fact that the team would be distracted trying to avoid harm befalling innocent bystanders and therefore be more vulnerable. He swore again when he realized that he'd flipping left Tezuna's home almost completely unprotected aside from a few traps he'd shown Tezuna's family to avoid in case he wasn't around to set off the others for some reason, as he deemed automatic traps that didn't require someone there to set them off to be a danger in this case, especially with small children and untrained civilians around. Looking back now, he realized that he should have thought to leave at least one clone behind to activate the traps he had set. As Tetsuo-sensei used to say, bad things happen when people don't think. After he finished swearing, he made a few cage bunshin while Sasuke was busy cutting down Zabuza's Mizu bunshin at Kakashi's urging and dispatched them to Tezuna's residence in case there was someone else waiting in the wings to try something underhanded while he and his team were otherwise occupied. Zabuza had one accomplice with him, and logic dictated that where there was one, there was usually more and that any of the ones he couldn't see in front of him could be getting up to any amount of mischief. When he turned back to the fight after sending the clones off, the Zabuza guy himself had shown up along with his masked accomplice. The instant after they appeared, Sasuke volunteered to be the one to deal with the accomplice, which meant that he would be hanging back with the rest of the team and protecting the client until it looked like Sasuke needed assistance. Despite the prodigious speed of Zabuza's accomplice, who was so fast that he created his own whirlwind, Sasuke had him evenly matched. This wasn't all that surprising considering that two areas that Sasuke seemed to really shine in were speed and taijutsu, so he was the better choice to face Zabuza's accomplice in a straight-up fight in this case. From the looks of things, Sasuke wouldn't be needing any help despite his opponent's surprising ability to make one-handed seals, which was revealed when Sasuke had restrained the other hand. Based on Sasuke's current speed and the speed of those water, or rather ice senbon, Sasuke would be able to easily escape the jutsu. His job for now was to protect the client from Zabuza, who had not yet made a single move in their direction since the destruction of his Mizu bunshin for some strange reason. Inari had been on the toilet when he had heard the loud swearing coming from outside. His first thought when he'd heard it had been that one of the neighbors had stopped by for a visit and had run afoul of one of Naruto's traps. He'd nearly done that himself on more than one occasion, and had almost had to be rescued once. That initial notion had been thrown out the window when he heard his mother scream and several dishes shatter, however. When he ran out of the toilet to see what was happening, he saw two men with swords taking his mother hostage. One of the men had tattoos on his face that reminded him of clown makeup and was wearing a hoodie, and the other one, who wore an eye patch with 3 straps, was topless and covered in tattoos. When they noticed him, the one with the tattoos on his chest and arms moved to attack him. "If you hurt him, I'll kill myself," his mother said, halting the man in his tracks. "You need a hostage, right? And you won't have one if you harm him. The man, who was some sort of rogue swordsman, turned away from him and back to his mother, who glared at him defiantly, daring him to make a move. The rogue swordsman and his partner then bound his mother and started dragging her away as he stood by and watched helplessly. They had taken his mother and there had been nothing he could do about it. If Naruto were here, he would. Whatever he would do, it wouldn't be standing here watching as his mother was dragged away like he was doing. That Kakashi man had told him as much a couple days earlier. The boy named Naruto who'd lectured him on his first day here came in 5 minutes after the boy named Sasuke, completely wiped from his training. When he slumped over at the dinner table after the meal had ended, it was obvious that he was completely exhausted, even more so than the Sasuke boy, who looked pretty tore up himself. "Why?" he asked. "Why do you do this when it's not even your fight? It's not your country, and it's not your business. Why do you do this even knowing that you're just going to die?" "Because this was once my mother's home. And even if it wasn't her home, I'd do it anyway because it's the right thing to do," Naruto replied, sounding upset. "I could just as easily ask you why you sit around wailing that you can do nothing while your people suffer without even trying to do something about it." Unable to reply to the boy's accusation since he couldn't think of one that didn't sound like a pathetic excuse even to himself, he ran outside. Even though every reply he could think of sounded like an excuse, he knew that there was nothing that he could do about the way things were. He was just too small, and there was only one of him. As he was sitting on the dock that was attached to the house thinking how unfair the Naruto boy's question had been, Naruto's teacher came outside and joined him. "Naruto's like you in some ways," Kakashi-san said. "He never knew his father while growing up as well." As he furiously scrubbed the tears from his eyes so he wouldn't look like a total sissy in front of this stranger, he wondered why the man was telling him this. He never knew his mother either, since both of his parents died the day he was born. He had no friends as a small child, but he never let that get him down, and I've never once seen him cry about the fact that he was alone, even when there had been no one there for him. I think he got tired of crying early on. Kakashi-san continued. He sat still wondering exactly where this story was going since so far, all he was hearing was that Naruto didn't cry despite the fact that he didn't have any parents. Naruto's life wasn't anything like his, however. No evil man had taken over his home and killed the man he'd called father right in front of him. What few friends he did manage to make became all the more precious to him because they had been few and far between. Kakashi-san continued. What did this have to do with him? So, Naruto had had a bad life, but not as bad as his. One day, 2 of his friends were killed, and 3 others were badly injured right in front of him, and he was then left to face 2 much larger and stronger opponents alone since there was nobody around to help. Kakashi-san said. What happened next? He asked, realizing what the man had finally been getting at. Instead of fleeing, Naruto did what he had to do to save his friends, even though there was a very good chance that he could die doing so. At that point, all he cared about was getting his remaining friends to safety, and he did everything it took to do so despite the fact that he was out-armed, outnumbered, and the enemy held the advantage. Kakashi-san replied. Here he was in a similar situation to the one Naruto had been in back then. His mother was being taken away from him, and rather than fighting, he was sitting and crying about not being able to do anything without even once trying. His stepfather Kaiza had told him that if there was something precious to you, you protected it with your own 2 hands, even if it meant risking dying. Right now, the most precious thing in his life was being taken from him, and he wasn't even trying to protect it. Like hell, there was a time when someone had to stop crying and running away, and stand up to fight for what was theirs no matter how strong the people taking it from them were, and that time was now. Let go of my mom, he yelled at the 2 men who were leading his mother away after he'd run from the house and onto the wooden walkway that led to the path to the village to confront them. Run, Inari, his mother yelled as the 2 men whirled to face him. As she yelled for him to flee, one of the men knocked her to the ground. They had hurt his mother. He was going to kill them. He had no weapons, and the men who had his mother had swords, but that didn't matter. Like in that old story, he would hit them, and, if they cut off his arms, he would kick them, and, if they cut off his legs, he would bite them to death. He wasn't going to let them take his mother away from him. His mother was one of the most precious things in his life, and he would do everything in his power to protect her. The men moved to attack him, and he suddenly found himself elsewhere. Thanks for distracting them, kid, said Naruto, who had shown up out of nowhere, taken him out of the path of danger, and was unbinding his mother whom he had rescued as well. I wasn't sure if I would make it in time. As he stared up at the other boy in wonder, he heard something behind him. When he turned to see what the commotion behind him was, he saw that it was two more Narutos who were beating the crap out of the men who had taken his mother. Seems you really do have a backbone, kid. Naruto, or was it another one of his clones? Said as he patted him on the head. Moments after the fight started, the two men who had taken his mother were down on the ground, bruised, bleeding, and unconscious, brought low by someone who was only half their size. Seeing them in this state, he realized that they were not the insurmountable obstacles he had at first thought them to be. It was as Naruto had said earlier, they were only strong as long as you did nothing. In that case, he would make everyone do something, and they would take the strength away from the biggest of the monsters. He would rally everyone, and have them fight. This was their home, and Gato couldn't have it. Where are you going? Naruto asked when he turned back to the house to grab any weapons he could find. I'm going to get everyone, and we'll get Gato together, he replied. Well, in that case, I think I'll help. It's better than just hanging around here looking after you guys. Naruto replied. Besides, I will be needing to tell the villagers what areas to avoid if boss and the others fail at the bridge, and it comes down to a street fight. Naruto watched as Sasuke became trapped in an unknown jutsu that involved sheets of ice. Within the jutsu, the boy with the name that was very familiar for some reason was peppering Sasuke with senbon. He knew for a fact that the boy was deadly accurate with those things since he had paralyzed his master with them by unerringly throwing them at points that were very close to spots that would have been fatal, which made this activity more puzzling, unless the boy wasn't actively trying to kill Sasuke. Outside of the fight between Sasuke and Zabuza's accomplice, there was a virtual standstill as they stood facing Zabuza, who had yet to make a move. Why were their opponents not actively trying to kill them? He knew that part of the reason that Zabuza hadn't tried to kill them was because Kakashi was keeping Zabuza in check in regards to Tazuna, and Zabuza was keeping Kakashi in check in regards to Sasuke. In that fight, neither would move until one or the other was certain of their advantage, which was the reason why Zabuza currently wasn't trying to turn them into sashimi with that sword. Sasuke's opponent, however, there was no reason for Zabuza's accomplice to spare Sasuke, no reason at all. He had him completely outclassed in that jutsu, and could have ended it all in the first strike. Instead of killing him right away, however, he was giving Sasuke a very slow death with 1,000 paper cuts and every opportunity to figure out a way to defeat his opponent. As he watched the fight, trying to figure out what Zabuza's accomplice was up to, Sakura went over and tossed a kunai to Sasuke, who had dropped his in the boy Haku's initial attack. The kunai didn't reach its intended recipient, however, because Haku went through the other side of one of the mirrors he'd rather foolishly assumed had been one way and caught the thrown weapon before it could reach Sasuke. This gave him the first bit of good news he'd had throughout the entire battle. If Zabuza's apprentice was forced to fight on both sides of the mirrors, there would be an increased chance of the boy making a mistake that would allow them to defeat him. With that in mind, he made his way over to the unusual jutsu that was a result of a Kekkei Genkei in which Sasuke was trapped, hoping that Sakura and Kakashi would be enough to protect Tazuna should Zabuza finally decide that attacking would be to his advantage. When he reached the dome of ice mirrors, he circled it looking for any weaknesses. There were none that he could see. After his first circuit, he decided to check the strength of the mirrors themselves. As he was powering up one of his wind jutsu, Zabuza threw several shuriken at him, which Haku knocked off course with several senbon. Please let me deal with them, Zabuza-sama, the boy named Haku said as the shuriken clattered to the ground. Fine Haku, go ahead, Zabuza replied before turning back to his standoff with Kakashi. Sasuke took the opportunity to attack since Haku was distracted with him, but it didn't do him much good since the boy hadn't been nearly as distracted as he had seemed, and he intercepted Sasuke's attack and made yet another attack on Sasuke. In this attack, Sasuke was hit by about 1,000 more senbon, and yet again the needles caused minimal damage, slicing here, scraping there, none of them stabbing into the boy who looked a bit like a pincushion. During Haku's attack on Sasuke, he attacked one of the mirrors with the wind jutsu he'd been in the middle of forming when Zabuza had thrown his shuriken and it did not break. It didn't even so much as crack. The Zabuza's accomplice responded to this attack by sending a volley of senbon in his direction while tossing yet another one at Sasuke. Undaunted, he attacked the mirror again at the same point that he had attacked it before, hoping to further weaken it. Nothing. He attacked it again. Still nothing. Inside the mirrors, Sasuke used one of his fireball jutsu. The mirror that it hit briefly started to melt by the time the fireball had burnt itself out, and rapidly reformed shortly after it had done so. He attacked the mirror that took the brunt of Sasuke's attack, hoping that the melting and reformation of the mirror had weakened it somehow. Nothing there either. Realizing that he was getting nowhere, he decided to use the strongest of his small arsenal of wind jutsu on the mirrors, despite the fact that he only had it half-mastered and Tetsuo-sensei would have given him hell for using a jutsu he hadn't fully mastered in battle. After making the seals for the Kazekiri no Jutsu, he launched the blade of wind at the mirror closest to him. It barely made a dent. "Why do you try so hard to defend him?" the boy Haku asked. "Is he precious to you?" "No," he replied honestly. "But my mother and the Yondaime entrusted me with the protection of Konoha and its citizens before they died, and they are precious to me. I will not let anyone from Konoha be harmed if there is anything I could do to prevent it. I will not let them down. I too have someone I need to protect," the boy said. "Being a shinobi is difficult for me, and I do not want to kill you, but I will kill my heart and be a shinobi in order to protect my precious person. He has entrusted his dreams to me, and I will not let him down either. I'm sorry." With that, the boy started to attack Sasuke once more. There was nothing he could do about it from out here but try to break the jutsu, since the boy was moving far too fast. Perhaps, he sent a number of Kage Bunshin into the jutsu to assist Sasuke. They were promptly dispelled, but Zabuza's accomplice had been distracted from Sasuke while they lasted. Hoping to keep the masked boy distracted, he sent in another wave while he attempted to break one of the mirrors with an explosive tag. The mirror yet again refused to break. Hearing some sort of commotion behind him, he turned to look. While he'd been focused on freeing Sasuke, the standoff between Kakashi and Zabuza had finally heated up into a battle. That's all for now. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments.